Welcome to the 2021 Sierra Nevada Watershed Improvement Program. My name is Angela Avery. I am the Executive Officer of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. As many of you already know, we are a state conservancy under California Natural Resources Agency, and our focus really is the triple bottom line, so the environmental, economic, and social well-being of the Sierra Nevada region and its communities. This is our 7th annual WIP Summit, and we're absolutely thrilled with the level of interest and participation in this year's topic, which is building the restoration economy in the Sierra Nevada. I'm excited and honored to be here with you all today and with a talented and knowledgeable group of experts and leaders, both in economic development and in forest restoration. We've got a really packed agenda today, and so I'll start it off with a couple of comments, but so that you know what's coming, we're going to start this morning with an opening keynote by Secretary Wade Crowfoot from the California Natural Resources Agency. We'll follow Secretary Crowfoot with a presentation from Nils Christoffersen from Wallowa Resources. Mr. Christoffersen, Wallowa Resources, that is supporting a restoration economy that's actually working in northeastern Oregon. From there, we'll transition to a first panel that will be moderated by SNC's Elisa Brown. We'll take a quick break, and then we'll conclude with the second panel that will be moderated by SNC's Elliot Vanderkolk. But before I introduce Secretary Crowfoot for our keynote address, I want to set the stage for everyone by laying out at a really high level why the SNC cares about building restoration economies in the Sierra Nevada and what we really mean by those. So with record-breaking wildfire and a pandemic that impacted travel and tourism economies in the Sierra Nevada, 2020 really showed for us how precarious life in the Sierra Nevada can be. It really underscored for us as well that we really need to be thinking holistically about how we build resilient Sierra Nevada communities and a larger resilient Sierra Nevada region. So what do I mean when I say resilient Sierra Nevada region? What I really mean by that is integrating our focus on forest health and wildfire threat reduction with initiatives that can grow and diversify the region's economy. There's a relationship between our forests and our communities. Human communities have managed forests from time immemorial, and our forests have always provided humans with vital resources. The nature of this relationship has changed over time and is currently undergoing another transformation. In the last century, the relationship between forests and rural communities was characterized by timber mills, which were often a community's main employer. As the Forest Service shifted emphasis from extraction to restoration, many communities lost vital economic centers. This shift to the focus on forest restoration is really happening now, and it's being encouraged by state policy efforts to enhance the climate and biodiversity benefits of natural and working lands. Both the forest management side of the equation and the community development side of the equation need our attention so that our communities are able to grow and thrive within a healthy forest environment. There are a handful of questions that we need to be thinking about as we think about forest restoration economies. Some of these include, in this new era of forest management focused on restoration and sustainability, how do we really create the right balance between forests and communities? What types and kinds of economic activity can be supported from the forest's resources? How can these industries in turn support the forest restoration work that we know needs to be done at a pretty amazing scale across the Sierra Nevada? And how do we appropriately scale our economies to be durable and resilient to future shocks, be those pandemic or wildfire? So enter the restoration economy. When we talk about building a restoration economy in the Sierra Nevada, we're really talking about 4 sort of groups of activities: implementing ecologically sound forest restoration work on the ground, supporting organizational capacity to be able to plan and manage and maintain and implement the work over time, building up a workforce that's needed to do prescribed fire, thinning, fuel break work, environmental permitting, surveys, that kind of thing. and establishing wood processing infrastructure at the right size and in the right place to utilize the biomass that's generated as a byproduct of forest restoration. We at the S&C really feel like this is an opportune time to channel energy and investment into a long-term strategy that reduces wildfire risk, enhances the climate benefits of natural and working lands, and really raises all economic boats while doing so. The process of reimagining a timber industry as a restoration industry whose primary product can be measured in acres of ecologically resilient forested landscapes and sustainable communities rather than board feet of lumber isn't going to be an easy one. It's going to take a combined effort between state and federal agencies, universities and colleges, nonprofits, and entrepreneurs. The widely shared benefits attached to this effort, air and water quality, biodiversity, forest carbon stabilization, we believe make it really appropriate for socially motivated investment and philanthropic institutions. And we've been engaged in this work for over 10 years. Some of the successes that you're going to hear about today have been supported by our grants and our staff. And we know that there's a lot of work left to be done, and we hope that today's speakers and panelists both inform and help point a way forward as we think about these opportunities. And now I'd like to introduce Wade Crowfoot, Secretary of California Natural Resources Agency. Secretary Crowfoot is here with us today to talk a little bit about the state's commitment to and role in advancing California's restoration economies. So Secretary Crowfoot, thank you for being here with us today. I'm going to turn this over to you.
Can you hear me now?
There we go. There you go. Perfect.
Hey, sorry, Angie, and thanks for the opportunity to share some framing thoughts with you. Like so many others, I'm challenged with bandwidth issues at my home. I've got a wife working inside as well as a 6-year-old zooming into class. So I think everybody can relate to that. So I was trying to be on my earbuds, but alas. Listen, great to be with you here today on this important topic. And first and foremost, I hope everybody is safe and healthy. I feel really optimistic about the coming months, given where we're at on vaccine distribution. You may know that in California, we've now distributed over 10 million vaccines. I think on the list of countries in terms of the vaccines distributed, California is actually 7th or 6th among all the countries in the world. And we're gaining momentum. So I hope you share my optimism for the coming months and returning towards normalcy, which I think we all need in our lives and in our families and certainly in our communities and economy. So while we've been obviously dealing with this crisis of pandemic over the last year, we continue to contend with another major crisis facing the state, and that is the crisis of catastrophic wildfire. And I imagine for almost everybody in this discussion today, I don't need to spend too much time describing the problem because you all know the problem well or are living with the problem in your work or your daily lives. But let me just explain how I educate others, which is, obviously wildfire is natural to our state's ecology. It's important to our natural cycles. That being said, decades of fire exclusion from the land combined with the changing climate and rising temperatures have created a perfect storm for worsening catastrophic wildfire. We know that 17 of the 20 largest wildfires in the state's 170-year history have happened in the last 20 years. So 17 of 20 largest in the state's history in the last 20 years. And then, of course, 5 of the 6 largest wildfires in the state's history were burning at the same time last summer as a result of that remarkable electrical storm. And the results are obviously devastating across the Sierra and across the state. Whether you're a community that's where your public safety is threatened by wildfire, or you're somebody who works in the timber industry and see your livelihood impacted, or you're basically anyone in the state who had to contend with dangerous air quality for a significant portion of last summer. So the problem statement is very clear, and we need to double down on how we're going to respond to it. Now, obviously, responding to wildfires is is a critical component of keeping our communities safe. I'm really proud that CAL FIRE is part of our Natural Resources Agency. I call it the most sophisticated wildland firefighting force in the world. It's also one of the largest. And thanks to the legislature and the governor in recent years, we've surged the force at CAL FIRE, both from the number of people fighting those fires, as well as all of the equipment and technology we're bringing to the firefight. And we need to continue to invest in that response and frankly support the U.S. Forest Service in doing the same, as well as our local fire response agencies. But while response is essential, we know we're not going to respond our way out of this crisis. And that's why we have doubled down in recent years and more than ever this year on building our state's wildfire resilience. You all know what wildfire resilience means, but I'll just share with you the way I describe it, which is protecting our people and nature from the impacts of catastrophic wildfire. So from my perspective, we're engaged in somewhat of a paradigm shift where it's not response or resilience, it's response and resilience. And we are scaling up, really taking a quantum leap in actually what we're doing to build that wildfire resilience. Huge thanks to the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and frankly, the other conservancies around the state for leading on wildfire resilience. I think Sierra Nevada Conservancy is really, among the sort of the state leaders identifying sort of what we need to do, and importantly, getting projects on the ground with landscape scale. So this paradigm shift, started last summer when Governor Newsom signed a historic agreement with the U.S. Forest Service and its chief, Vicki Christensen, the so-called shared stewardship agreement. And among other things within that agreement, both the state and the federal government committed to conducting or completing 500,000 acres of forest management projects each, 500,000 feds, 500,000 state each year, with obviously a focus and a commitment to doing these projects in an ecologically beneficial way. So that was one of the commitments. Other commitments included shared mapping to identify priority projects, to integrate more the federal and state work, as well as more integration of regional partners in that work. And if you want to find out more about that, you can literally just Google Shared Stewardship Agreement, California, USFS, and you can find out more about that. So that was an important foundation for this paradigm shift. Also, later last year, the work of the Forest Management Task Force, which some of you have participated in over the last 2+ years, began to bear fruit. And that is under Patrick Wright, who took over as acting director of the task force for Jennifer Montgomery. We began to distill all of the recommendations from the work of that Forest Management Task Force and its working groups. The idea being, let's create a comprehensive action plan that identifies everything that we need to do in the state in one place, that builds upon historic plans, whether that's the carbon plan or so-called Safeguarding California, but in one place, develop an action plan based on the recommendations of the task force. And that action plan was completed and actually issued in January, called the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan. Huge thanks to those of you who participated in the task force over the last couple of years. That task force not only included state agencies and federal agencies, but local partners and other stakeholders. And we are really proud of the action plan because we think it represents a comprehensive set of actions that we can measure ourselves against and hold ourselves accountable for making progress on. Then the third component, in addition to the stewardship agreement and the action plan that really represents this paradigm shift, is the governor's proposed budget, which is currently being evaluated by the legislature. Governor Newsom proposed $1 billion of investment in wildfire resilience activities. Keep in mind that past annual investments in resilience probably averaged a little less than 100 million. So this is an increase of 10x in actions on wildfire resilience. Importantly, both the budget and the action plan elevated the criticality of regional leadership and regional customization. What we've realized over years, and many of you know intuitively, is wildfire resilience is not a one-size-fits-all solution that gets created in Sacramento. Resilience looks very different in Southern California than it does on the North Coast or the Sierra Nevada, Northern Sierra Nevada compared to the Bay Area. So if we suggested that we could spend $1 billion sort of uniformly across the state in the exact same ways, we would be completely missing the point that we will become more resilient by identifying the specific challenges and opportunities of each region. So that's a really critical principle, and I think it underscores a lot of what you're going to be talking about in the discussion here today. Sierra Nevada Conservancy, obviously through the Central Sierra Initiative and a lot of the partnerships that exist within the Sierra, has already, in essence, built a regional vision around wildfire resilience, and frankly, started to queue up the strategies and actions that need to take place. And as a result, Sierra Nevada Conservancy, from our perspective, is a key delivery mechanism for resilience. And as a result, a significant portion of funding within our proposed budget would actually run through the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, frankly, because it established that framework and vision and actually has projects that can get on the ground. Another key sort of paradigm shift within the budget and the action plan is trying to build a sort of a pipeline and funding and sort of continuous support for projects. We need to get away from this episodic off again, on again investment in wildfire resilience. You all know that projects take years to develop and get underway. And if you have this spigot of investment that turns on and off, you can't actually make progress on a broad resilience strategy within a region. So this $1 billion of proposed investment is actually fairly unique, and it's enabled, at least as we envision it, to be spent over multiple years, 5 to 7 years. That really will create a pipeline of, or I should say, consistent funding to fund a pipeline of projects developed by regional efforts. Another paradigm shift is, there was a debate, it seemed, a few years ago around whether you should spend on landscape management or so-called forest management, or spend within the communities on activities like home hardening, defensible space, evacuation planning. And the action plan and the budget clearly indicate that you need to do both, right? We obviously need to restore the health of our landscapes, not only our coniferous forests in the Sierra Nevada, but our chaparral environments in Southern California, our oak woodlands in the foothills of the Central Valley. We know we need to do this landscape scale restoration work. But we also know that we need to do more to protect communities within and around communities. So in addition to major investments or proposed investments in landscape stewardship, we are proposing significant investments in these emergency fuel breaks around communities, expanding this successful work over the last few years, prioritizing fuel breaks that can stop or slow down fire coming into communities. And then, of course, do more to actually build the resilience within communities through a major home hardening pilot project in partnership with FEMA and the federal government, more funding for defensible space, education, and enforcement, and then more funding that would go directly to cities or counties to do their own resilience planning on aspects like educating the public to be ready, emergency communication, like I said, evacuation planning. So, my colleague Jessica Morris talks about it in concentric circles, the tightest concentric circle being in the community, investments in the community, investments around the community, those fuel breaks, emergency fuel breaks, and then broader investment across landscapes. Ultimately, our goal is, of course, to protect communities across California from this catastrophic wildfire, both people and property. It's to protect the environment and restore this natural wildfire ecology and more natural forest and landscape function. and as we combat climate change, to ensure that our forests across the Sierra and the state are carbon sinks. In other words, absorbing carbon versus being sources of carbon, like last summer when they're emitting a whole lot of noxious pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. In this work, I'll lastly say that as the administration working for Governor Newsom, we look to our partners on the ground, starting first and foremost with tribal communities that have been stewarding California's land since time immemorial. And we know that many of the practices to manage those landscapes, like prescribed fire, were actually outlawed in the state for over a century. And so as we understand how to restore the ecological health of our landscapes, we look to our tribal communities and our tribal partners to learn from and to truly partner with on this work. And then also we look to the leadership of folks on the ground in the communities getting this work done. Whether you're part of a resource conservation district, or you work for a county, or you work for a company in the forest management sector, you all know what needs to get done, and you all know what we need to do to remove barriers from getting it done. And so we're committed to not only hopefully, if the legislature concurs, getting this scaled up investment into regions across the state based on this framework in the action plan, but really working with you to remove barriers to move further and faster. And to, as we do that, to really build economic opportunities across the Sierra. We know that government funding, whether it's state or federal, is not going to achieve the scale of landscape management, forest management that we need across the state. And we know there are good opportunities to sustainably manage landscapes and build jobs and economic prosperity in communities. So as you dig in today, obviously to the your discussion, as well as what the action plan and our budget calls for, you'll see significant investments through our Climate Catalyst Fund in getting money to small businesses and to workforce development to make sure that we actually have the businesses and the workforce that can help us scale up this landscape management, and in the process, build prosperity across the region. So Angie, I'm excited to kick this off. And of course, thank you for all of your partnership at the Sierra Nevada Conservancy. You guys have been showing for quite a while how we can get this work done. And I think you're going to be a critical, central sort of implementation mechanism as we shift our paradigm to protect California.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here, Secretary Crowfoot. I think that the paradigm shift that you're talking about is exactly the motivator for us in wanting to talk. We've got potential funding, we've got the right partnerships, we've got some investment, we understand the needs. How do we get it all the way to the home run and include and find ways to support the added wood processing infrastructure that allows us to do this holistically and really support these rural communities? Of course, the SNC, we look forward to ongoing opportunities to work with you and CNRA and our federal partners and our local partners to make this vision a reality. And so we really appreciate you being here with us today and kicking things off. Unfortunately, we don't have time for Q&A, but I do want to encourage our audience members, if you have questions, you can type them in the Q&A section. And Secretary Crowfoot, if you can hang out a little bit, we'll if you see any questions, you should feel free to respond, but we also understand that you're busy. If you can't hang out, again, thank you for your presence and for kicking us off today.
Thank you, Angie.
You're welcome. Next, I want to introduce Nils Christoffersen. Nils is the Executive Director of Wallowa Resources. I know I'm getting that name a little bit wrong, but Nils is here with us today to paint a picture of an actual restoration economy at work in Oregon. So Nils, I'm going to turn this over to you, but thank you so much for being here with us today as well.
Thank you, Angie. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all. As Angie mentioned, I'm Nils Christoffersen, the Executive Director of Wallowa Resources, a community-based nonprofit in Oregon. And I'm here to share a short story about our work in partnership with the county government and many others responding to the dramatic changes in federal forest management and forest conditions and risks in general, that hit our community hard in the 1990s. Wallowa County is a little over 3,100 square miles, about 2 million acres, with a population that has hovered around 7,000 people since the 1920s. It's located in the very northeast corner of Oregon, with 3 roads in and out in the summer and 2 in the winter. And during winter storms, both of those roads are occasionally closed. About 58% of the county is federal land administered by the U.S. Forest Service. These national forests include Oregon's largest wilderness area and over 70% of the county's forest lands. The county is ceded land of the Nez Perce tribe, who retain hunting, fishing, gathering, and grazing rights, amongst others. For the better part of the 20th century, the economy was strong, driven by natural resources, farming, livestock production, and forestry. Similar to rural places across the US, this foundation began to erode in the 1970s and 80s with shifts in national farm, economic and trade policy, increased automation and in production and manufacturing, and public pressure on national forest management, demanding increased consideration of species conservation and ecosystem services. All of this accelerated change. When Chinook salmon were listed under the Endangered Species Act, there was nearly a 2-year cessation of timber sales off our national forests. And since 1994, the average annual harvest is down over 90% relative to the 1970s and 80s. All 3 of our sawmills closed, and there was a cascade of job losses and social and community impacts. In response, local citizens, with encouragement and support from county government, created the nonprofit Wallowa Resources. With a mission focused on sustainability, providing equal weight to forest, watershed, and community health, job and business creation, and increased understanding of the interdependence of environment and community well-being. Over time, the vision embraced what we now call a stewardship economy, centered on regenerative agriculture, forest and watershed restoration, small-scale value-added processing, and renewable energy production, as well as community tenure over critical assets, including our working lands. But Wallowa Resources' beginnings had 2 priorities: ensure displaced forest and mill workers found rewarding work, and develop new products and markets for small diameter trees. By the late 1990s, the value of Forest Service contracts in Northeast Oregon exceeded the value of their timber sales. Local contractors typically won the majority of the timber sales, but secured less than 15% of the service contracts. In response, we unleashed a suite of programs to diversify this forest sector, expanding opportunities beyond timber harvest to include forest and watershed restoration. Working with the Pinchot Institute of Conservation, we advocated for the Forest Service and others to shift from low bid contracts to best value contracting, and the inclusion of local economic benefit as an evaluation criteria. We provided training programs and issued locally competitive restoration contracts to build local capacity. As a result, several logging contractors diversified to include service contract work, and new businesses were created. Within years, local contractors were capturing 54% of the service contract work on regional national forests. And our region has maintained higher contractor capacity than other areas that lost mills. All of this has been critical to our current large landscape restoration work across public and private lands. By the late 1990s, it was already clear that the legacy of past forest management, including decades of fire suppression, invasive species, and climate change, were impacting our forests. Forest cover had expanded, stand density had increased, and shade-tolerant species were more dominant. Together, these factors contributed to an increased frequency and severity of disturbance and a loss of resilience. most evidence in forest fire, but including insect and disease outbreaks. And given our regional focus on salmon restoration and the continued importance of agriculture, we also followed emerging evidence that forest conditions were very likely contributing to lower late summer in-stream flows. Responding to the science and the risks, we worked with the County Natural Resource Advisory Committee and the U.S. Forest Service on a series of pilot forest restoration projects that targeted understory thinning and generated broad public support. The sophistication of these projects has increased over time as scientists and managers have refined the selection of stands, the prescriptions, and recognized the need for increased scale to break up the horizontal and vertical continuity of fuels and restore large landscape patterns of open and closed forests. Following these successful pilot projects, we worked with the Forest Service to design a community planning process to scale up our landscape treatments and community impacts. This process convened representatives from the Nez Perce tribe, environmental, timber, grazing interests, recreation interests, and others to craft agreement on large landscape restoration. The first large watershed project, covering 174,000 acres of public and private land, restored 30 miles of salmon habitat and 15,000 acres of upland public forest, earning national awards and contributing to the emergence of forest collaboration nationwide. The timber sales went forward without appeals or litigation, a first in our county in over a decade. Oregon State Extension estimated the local economic benefit at over $6 million. Additional opportunities arose from this initial success, including community wildfire protection planning, USDA Joint Chiefs landscape restoration partnership projects, Firewise community formation, and the acquisition of the 1,800-acre East Moraine Community Forest. Last summer, Secretary Perdue approved new funding to the Northern Blues Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project, spanning 10 million acres of public and private and tribal lands in Northeast Oregon and Southeast Washington. We now anticipate over 60 million in federal, state, tribal, and private restoration investment over the next 10 years. With increased volume of small diameter logs, it was critical to build utilization capacity and markets for this material. With over 20 years of R&D partnered with the Forest Service and Oregon State University Forest Products Lab, public and private investment, and a good deal of perseverance, we now have a unique small diameter log facility. It's kind of a sort yard and integrated biomass utilization center combined. The existence of this facility close to the forest has increased the viability of U.S. Forest Service stewardship contracts and increased the acres of forest restoration completed. It has created year-round manufacturing jobs and additional markets for forest restoration work off private land. The facility recovers saw logs as a first selection criteria from the restoration harvests. While not a large percentage of the overall volume processed, the occasional 16-foot, 6-inch blocks off the large end of the processed logs are additional volume made available to the remaining sawmills in our region. Volume that otherwise would have been burned in slash piles or sent to a pulp mill. The larger value of this facility to the remaining mills is the improved economics of U.S. Forest Service sales, providing better value for the higher percentage of small diameter material in many U.S. Forest Service restoration projects in our region. And as part of the broader strategy around biomass utilization and renewable energy, we supported the design and installation of biomass thermal energy systems, including the first modern wood heat system in an Oregon public school installed in the Enterprise School District in 2008, as well as a system in our own office building, the Wallowa Resources Stewardship Center, which we repurposed after having accepted the old hospital building from the healthcare district, and a modern biomass boiler that supports a variety of heat processing needs and workplace heating at the small log processing facility I just mentioned. The combined value of all the renewable energy projects in our county is measured in energy dollars saved in our community, dollars that can be spent on teachers, books, food, and other community investments. We measure our success in contribution to jobs and business creation tied to working lands, improving the ecological condition of these lands, and preventing their conversion to other uses. More broadly, we assess our role in building an inclusive community, eliminating inequities in access and opportunity, and expanding engagement in our mission. We pursue increased impact in geographic scale, cross-boundary cooperation, and the number of partners, landowners, students, businesses, and jobs that we interact with and impact. Across the West, we support our community, we support other communities interested in a stewardship economy, which is part of the reason it's a pleasure to be here this morning. Today, all of our work is framed by the desire to advance a model of stewardship economies. We do recognize and encourage economic diversification for rural places across the West. However, we believe it's critical to retain as an essential value and purpose of rural places, land and natural resource stewardship. We believe the human and natural capital of rural areas are its most valuable assets, and putting people and natural resources back to work are essential to meeting the needs of society now and in the future. This work must ensure the continued integrity, condition, and function of our natural systems. We must steward the soil, the grasslands, the forests, watersheds, fish and wildlife, air and water. It is the combination of values, the production of high quality food, fiber, and energy, along with the restoration and stewardship of our environment that provide unique value and purpose to rural places today. And it is that value and purpose that must motivate sustained public and private investment in rural America. Across the West, communities from Alaska to Montana and down to New Mexico are organizing around a common vision and set of values. With that, we see increasing potential for the rural stewardship economy today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nils. We share that passion that you have for rural economies, and I really appreciate you being here with us today to give that real-world example of how you guys are addressing this issue in your region of Oregon. We don't have time for direct question and answer, but I know there's at least one question in the Q&A. So if you can stay around a little bit longer, maybe type up a response, we'd be eternally grateful to you. And thank you again so much for being here with us today.
Thanks again for the invitation. It's been a pleasure to be here.
Our pleasure. Next, we're going to move to Elisa Brown, who is Sierra Nevada Conservancy's Partnerships and Community Support Coordinator. Elisa has been working in rural communities with economic development and thinking about how to increase the amount of wood processing infrastructure for as long as I've known her, which has been a little bit of time. So Elisa, let me turn this over to you to go ahead and introduce our next panel.
Thank you very much, Angie. So panelists, Dan, Steve, and Jonathan, you can turn your cameras on. And it's good to see you all. I also want to give my thanks to Nils for setting the stage. I think it was a really beautiful introduction to what we're talking about in this panel. What we're trying to do is focus on the vision for building the restoration economy in the Sierra Nevada and also in the state. So how will it impact the state's goals? How will it support community economies? And how will it build inclusive workforce opportunities? We will have some time, hopefully, for questions and answers at the end. So please type your questions in the box. And if you really like a question, you can upvote it by clicking on the thumbs up. So we'll be doing that at about the 45-minute mark. I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Dr. Daniel Sanchez. Dr. Sanchez studies the commercialization and deployment of energy technologies that remove CO2 from the atmosphere. As an assistant cooperative extension specialist at UC Berkeley, he runs the Carbon Removal Lab, which aims to commercialize sustainable negative emission technologies. Dan is also a member of the Joint Institute for Wood Products Innovation, which supports research and collaborative action to advance wood products in California. Next, we have Steve Walensky, who is a retired Calaveras County supervisor. He's currently the board chair of the Calaveras Healthy Impact Solutions, or CHIPS. This is a local nonprofit that performs forest stewardship and is also developing a community-scale forest biomass utilization campus, including a bioenergy plant. He initiated the Intertribal Stewardship Workforce Initiative, which started in Calaveras and Alpine County and is now spread throughout the Sierra Nevada region. It's a wonderful program that I hope he'll talk a little bit about. Finally, we have Dr. Jonathan Kusel, who is the founder and executive director of the Sierra Institute for Community and Environment, which works to improve the health of landscapes and rural forested communities by bringing people and ideas together. Dr. Kusel and his team built the first full cross-laminated timber building in California that houses a wood-fired boiler, which produces heat and electricity for Plumas County's Health and Human Services Center. The Sierra Institute has offered several entrepreneurial development programs for the region and was recently awarded a High Road Training Partnership Grant for tribal forest restoration workforce development, also very exciting. So I'd like to start with Dan. Can you talk a little bit about how the restoration economy is important to achieving the state's goals, both in terms of the ecosystem restoration work and wood products manufacturing and bioenergy?
Great. Well, thank you, Alyssa. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to start by re-emphasizing the kind of the four pillars of the restoration economy that Angie mentioned in her introduction. I think it's a good way to help center and focus the conversation, and that includes not only restoration on the ground, but also organizations to support and drive that work. A trained and thriving workforce, and then of course a wood processing infrastructure. Really related to the wood fiber and the forest residues that are produced as part of forest restoration. And, it's really in this wood processing infrastructure where we see an opportunity, I think, to address multiple climate change needs that are really at the front and the center for the state. So this includes not only, as Wade mentioned, kind of reducing the risk of catastrophic wildfire, something that I think everyone in the Sierras is unfortunately keenly aware of, and I think of that as a climate adaptation need. As our forests are becoming drier, as weather is changing throughout the state, as wind-driven events are increasing, we need forest restoration, whether through the form of prescribed fire or in many cases, mechanical vegetation treatment or fuels reduction in order to reduce that climate change driven wildfire impact risk. At the same time, we know that forest restoration doesn't just occur in a vacuum. It has an impact on the forests and the forest sinks that we are trying to manage for a number of different resources, but one of those resources, of course, is enhanced carbon storage. And this is really where I think the second half of the climate discussion really comes in. The wood or the carbon emissions benefits that can come from the responsible management of forests and sustainable forest practices, but also the utilization of otherwise low value or non-merchantable wood through wood processing infrastructure, I think is absolutely key to achieving kind of a climate-aligned vision for forest management in the state of California. So we know that, forest thinning, fuels reduction, it can mitigate these climate-related risks, but it many places these treatments are cost prohibitive. That's in part because of low demand for wood from small trees or tops or branches. The forest residues that are typically left in the forest to decay, or really kind of at best pile burned, where they are burned in place in the forest. They reduce, criteria air pollutants, and they really, it's a waste reduction paradigm rather than a value production paradigm. And so we think there's a real opportunity kind of in innovative use of that low value wood, with not only kind of improved carbon benefits, but also improved potential revenues associated with forest restoration, and associated again with mobilizing that wood. So we're really excited, both at my job at UC Berkeley, but also in working with the Joint Institute for Wood Products Innovation in the state, about a number of different wood processing technologies that we think can help increase the pace and scale of forest management. One of those products that we're really excited about are kind of these emerging engineered wood products. People talk a lot about kind of cross-laminated timber or mass timber. Those are exciting, but they typically do rely on dimensional lumber sourced from larger trees, some of which, of course, we'll be producing in California as part of forest restoration, but many of which has an existing market with sawmills and dimensional lumber. We think there's a broader class of engineered wood products that is able to use forest residues and smaller diameter trees. That can be something like oriented strand board, which we consume a lot of in our housing sector in the state of California, but is actually produced in Eastern Texas and shipped by rail, primarily to California, as well as other innovative wood products. Take your pick. You're talking about glue lam. You're talking about other kinds of laminated timbers. You're talking about other kinds of engineered wood products that can use small diameter wood. The second class of products that we're really excited about is making transportation fuels out of this biomass. And that allows us not only to, again, mobilize this wood and make a valuable product, but also to displace transportation fuels. We are trying to not only displace fossil intensive alternatives like steel or cement or transportation fuels by building things out of wood, and we're also kind of encourage the storage of carbon in a long-lived product. And it's really those two benefits. It's the carbon substitution benefit as well as the carbon storage benefit that really allow us to align this whole vision. This is a vision of using our forests sustainably and productively, using the products made from those forests, again, sustainability and productively, and then aligning not only, again, the need to reduce catastrophic wildfire risk, but the need to produce low-value products that align with the state of California's remarkably stringent, but also world-leading climate policy. And that's where we really drive this together. And again, I think it's the wood processing infrastructure and the products that kind of tie the whole restoration economy nicely together.
Thanks, Dan. That's the statewide perspective, and I'd like to move a little bit to the community scale perspective. So, Jonathan, you've been working with communities in a variety of contexts for a long time. Why does this community scale economic development work continue to be important?
Thank you, Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, SNC, for the invitation and for the variety of support to the many collaboratives, communities, and the work that we've been doing. We really appreciate it. Before I go to the community scale, let me step away just a little bit because I want to talk about some things that are concerning that have implications for community and community capacity to do this work. When we look at the impact of 2020 and we look at the jobs that were there a year ago, we've lost almost 4% of the federal jobs in the Sierra Nevada Conservancy area based on counties on average. We've lost 8% of state and local jobs. In leisure and hospitality, no surprise, we've lost over 25% of the jobs. And the highest five, Calaveras, Plumas, Siskiyou, Tuolumne, and Yuba lost almost 35% of their jobs. This sector, I'm relatively confident, will come back, but it is deeply affecting many of these communities now. We look at education and health, and we've lost 4% of the jobs across the Sierra Nevada Conservancy area on average. And then lastly, and this is the category that's most concerning to me, we've lost 13% of the manufacturing jobs just in the last year. And the highest 16% of the manufacturing jobs were lost includes Mariposa, Siskiyou, Tuolumne, Yuba, and there's a three-way tie of El Dorado, Placer, and Tehama for the fifth most manufacturing jobs lost. So those are the ones that are really concerning. And the challenge for rural communities is this issue of capacity and investment. Capacity in terms of having the wherewithal, the people who are there with the smarts to do the work, and then the people who are there to deal with the investment that they're asking for to invest in community scale. What's so important about community scale, directly to your question, Elisa, is this is an opportunity to tie investment to rural community restoration, rural community economic development, and forging this new stewardship bond between rural communities and landscape. The challenge, Dan mentioned, oriented strand board or biofuels facilities, to start on a lot of these things requires $25 million. And in those areas, there's virtually no folks that step up and say, I'm ready to go. We'll drop 25 million or 30 million or 80 million on a facility. And this relates, of course, to the workforce and the capacity of organizations and businesses to absorb and respond to that kind of investment. Make no mistake, we're pretty excited about things that are starting to happen. We're working with a number of communities that are seriously looking at it, and we're starting to see investors lining up to do some of this work because of the opportunity that presents itself. Back to the value of working at community scale. A lot of people have been concerned about bioenergy facilities or biomass utilization. If we tie it to community scale, what by nature we are talking about smaller to mid-sized facilities, not the gobbling facilities that characterized the industry for many years. And those were the big mills that had really broad areas from which they drew products and rightfully scared a lot of people about their use of resources or their intensive use, and some would say overly intensive uses of resources in a limited area. So going to scale is going to community scale, supporting local jobs, but also tying it very closely to environmental restoration needs. And that's a really great opportunity.
So let me just ask Dan as a follow-up question. You're the one who's studying these technologies. Do you see some of these emerging technologies being appropriate for that community scale?
I do, Elisa, and let me start by giving you the bad news, and then I can give you some of the good news. I think there are two things that really count against community scale. And as Jonathan mentioned, this is primarily driven by economics. We are dependent on wood markets, and these wood markets are innately tied to the health of our ecosystems. When you're dealing with a lot of these technologies, there is a capacity, or there is a tendency to observe what we call economies of scale, where larger facilities have lower levelized capital costs. And I think, when we're talking especially about some very large engineered wood products, as well as many of these field production processes, we have historically observed economies of scale associated with them. The second thing that really counts against this is, in many ways, the challenging economics of wood production and wood fiber within the Sierras. These are hard communities at times to access. These are hard communities. They are far from other population centers. Many reasons why it's hard to scale these things up in California. So I think we need to keep those in mind, but there are some real opportunities, I think, in order to kind of change that paradigm and to push a little bit, to push forward here. I do think that there are some technologies that are really well tied to community scale. We saw, for example, small diameter log mills in the previous presentation as one example in Northeast Oregon. I also think there's an opportunity around wood products campuses. Again, an idea of again, not only kind of bringing in some small diameter logs, also bringing in chip biomass and really having an opportunity for a diversified product base with a kind of a single manufacturing hub that's going to really allow you to kind of right size and properly tune your community size deployment to the sustainable forestry needs that we have. And I'll just say, I think there's a role for the state to step in here. Whether that is through investment or whether that is through driving demand. I just want to note that the state demand for wood is probably about 4 times the state supply of wood, and that opens a lot of opportunities for Californians to direct their buying purchases and buying habits towards forest restoration and towards sourcing California woods for their products. So I'm ultimately pretty hopeful about this.
Thank you. So I'd like to turn this over to Steve now. Steve, you've been doing some amazing work. I mean, you started working with the businesses in Calaveras County and then started working on the bioenergy facility, and then you started working on your Native American tribal crews, your workforce development work. I'd just like you to maybe tell us, do you see this making an impact? Have you seen an impact on communities based on the development, either of the restoration economy or the wood processing? And Steve, you're muted.
There we go.
Thank you.
There are a lot of impacts. CHIPS is known really for our perseverance in the face of adversities, and our communities were very similarly affected by closure of mills Nils was talking about, and the need to have a new economy developed. We started out the hard way with trying to develop a restoration economy, and it took a lot of breakthroughs on contracting, on building larger and larger scale projects, on training and developing a workforce to do it, and equipping it. None of these have come easily, but in terms of statistical effects, we've had 120 people certified in S212 sawyership. A number of people also doing, because we want to restore fire in prescribed ways in our area, and TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, with our workforce, which is 85% native in 6 tribal communities. The effects have been profound in some. The Hung-LLT community went from 78% unemployment as of 7 years ago, and mostly as a result of CHIPS employment is now reduced to 43%. Now that doesn't look like a really great number. Any community with 43% unemployment is in deep trouble, but the fact that we're moving it in the right direction is a good thing. Another effect in our own community was that we have created over 40 miles of fuel breaks, and that was credited in the Butte fire, which took 62,000 acres burned in many homes through Calaveras County 4 or 5 years ago. It was stopped along our fuel break in our area, and it's credited with having saved 3 towns, including my own. So some of us are really grateful for the Sierra Nevada Conservancy's investment in our work early on, and the assistance of many other groups, National Forest Foundation and others, that saw some possibilities in us and kept us alive through many challenges. Other things that are important are the idea that we can develop not just a bunch of sawyers and drip torch operators, but that there is true leadership in the Sierra. It has been untapped, and many of our models for developing leadership have to do with having kids from really great schools who are wonderful and full of energy and hope come with us and spend a year or two, I guess, slumming with us and helping lead these organizations. And the assumption is actually, or at least the implication is, that we don't have people right here in our communities, in tribal communities, and once proud but left for dead former timber communities, that somehow there isn't leadership to happen. And I'm pleased to say at least a couple of folks that have come in with CHIPS as Sawyers are now in CHIPS administration and in programs that were funded by the Sierra Nevada Conservancy and the Sierra Nevada Alliance, and that our new field operations manager is in training for that from the Hung-LLT community, and a guy who's helping manage and work on millions of dollars of projects is also came from that same community and is putting his life's work into development of new programs and managing the ones we have. The challenges, I hope there's enough time to say just a few. It's really hard to have, and it's more challenging to hire locally from these devastated, poverty-stricken rural communities than it is to bring in people from other places. But if you really want an economy, a stewardship and restoration-based economy to thrive in the Sierra, it requires us to overcome a number of hurdles. First, healthcare. People don't think that healthcare affects work in the Sierra sometimes, but I will tell you that we had 6 people who didn't know, because they'd never had healthcare and had no background in this, that they were allergic to bee stings. And we had 6 people nearly die from anaphylactic shock, stopped breathing and swelled up out there in the field, an hour away from the nearest hospital. And if we hadn't been bootlegging EpiPens, which is no easy task, by the way, we'd have 6 dead people instead of people who missed a day of work and went back. There's all kinds of issues with addiction. Poverty communities fell into patterns of addiction, methamphetamine and alcohol being our 2 favorites here. And how do you develop a workforce out of that kind of health degradation? And part of our work has to be in recovery, not just of forests and watersheds, but also people. Sweat lodges were effective in some of our work earlier, but now with COVID, which is another health issue, it has become harder to even find places and be together to support one another in our recoveries. COVID-19 has been devastating. We had 3 shutdowns of our work this year due to exposures. We had 14 people in one of our tribal groups get COVID. We've had a number of our own employees that suffered from that. And last week, we lost one of our foremen who died of COVID. So the devastation to communities reached a point where our shutdown in one place, people began to actually be required or volunteered, I should say, to dig graves for tribal elders. So a spirited 18-year course of growth and expansion last year became a struggle to survive. And it's existential in nature, and the healthcare in rural places and the ability to respond to these crises is important in being able to maintain a workforce. Transportation, housing, workers' comp implications in relation to health issues are also profound. And finally, the difficulty of converting sawmills to biomass facilities and small diameter wood The investments are not exactly legion, even though our policies are great and SB 1122 is wonderful. If it comes without funding in these rural areas, it doesn't really amount to accomplishment. And I know I'm out of time, but I could talk forever on this stuff. It's really important that we get this right. And it's really important that our local people get the support and the economic investment that's not just about forests and watersheds, but is about people and communities and infrastructure. That will allow us to sustain our work without all the grants and without the support. But the infrastructure is critical and we've got to address it.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's amazing what you do and that you continue to do it, even though it's very hard. It's really important work. And I'm so grateful to all of the other state agencies that have helped in supporting these tribal work crews, and hope that we can get even more comprehensive contributions by social services and housing and other agencies that are needed to really make this work. I'd like to just actually follow on with that by talking to Jonathan about, you just did get the High Road Training Partnership, which was an amazing thing, and was really proud of that. And can you talk a little bit more about this? You've also been doing work with entrepreneurial development, I know, because I'm the program officer on your grant. Where do you see this starting to get traction in communities? Where do you see things starting to move and starting to get success?
We see a variety of groups and communities that are gaining traction. But when we say gaining traction, these are small steps. So first, let me mention High Road Training Partnership. It is the Sierra Institute's great pleasure to be working with CHIPS and a half a dozen tribes and community colleges and others, putting together what we talk about as a scaffolding of opportunities. And by that, I mean, there is not a single pathway both to and through and gaining higher level jobs, but multiple pathways. And included in the High Road Training Partnership with CHIPS and partners, the Intertribal Stewardship Workforce Initiative, we've identified these different levels that include things as basic first aid. Steve underscored the need for that sort of thing, but also modules on traditional ecological knowledge, training workers about that, trying to understand and advancing tribal workforce around the training and sharing traditional ecological knowledge as it's appropriate to do so. And then even extending to heavy equipment operators. So we're trying to really build this workforce. And if somebody had said, you're going to start a NEPA crew at the Sierra Institute a few years ago, I would have said there's not a chance in the world. We want to extend that to others about how we do that and the wonderful partnership that we've established with the Lassen National Forest. So that's all part of this scaffolding that we've put together in this High Road Training Partnership with CHIPS and a number of other folks. So we're really excited about that. And Elisa, to your other question about what we call community build. And we started into this with just helping people think about and advance work around brownfields. We know there's plenty of mill sites that are no longer in operation. And unfortunately, they have left in some places a legacy of less healthy soils and conditions that need to be treated. So we're working with the tribe and others in advancing brownfields work, but we're also working with folks. Sometimes it's providing technological help just in terms of accounting services, general capacity building of all sorts. And so to that end, let me say, if folks are interested in securing additional support for that, please get in touch with us, because that's a grant from the Sierra Nevada Conservancy that is in play. And I'm also thrilled, as Dan talks about bioenergy facilities, we have about 6 communities moving together in terms of thinking about bioenergy, thinking about investment, because that's the scale we need to get at, instead of one group doing something and another group doing something, and they're all advancing these initiatives simultaneously but separately. So related to that, we're also having conversations about cooperative market development of products. So as Dan mentioned, wood product campuses. We want to see those. Sierra Institute has been advancing one itself in our impoverished rural Sierra Valley. It's slow going. We've already put $2.5 million into brownfields redevelopment. But we know that there's a lot of knowledge out there, and building on the work of Nils and his partners, we take lessons from them. And the more that we can share, the quicker that we can move these things. And this is a slow process, but we can never ignore the importance of capacity building and bringing folks along collectively in this process.
Right. So we are at the beginning of this process. What I'd like is for any of you to talk about sort of where you think this is going. Where does the path lead? And what's your vision for how if this goes to scale, what does it look like? And what do we need to get there? What are the most important types of support we need to get there? Dan, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, this has been a really great conversation so far. So excited to put some ideas on the table and then continue this with Q&A. Again, I want to focus on wood processing infrastructure and some of these opportunities to drive, new wood product innovations into the market. The Joint Institute has been thinking about this really since its founding in 2018. And I actually think we have a relatively good idea around what some of the early priorities are in this space. I had mentioned mass timber and low carbon or carbon negative fuels. I also think there are a few other opportunities on top of that are perhaps a little smaller and a little bit more right size for rural communities. As mentioned before, small diameter log mills, wood product campuses, maybe veneer manufacturing as one example of kind of an innovative wood product that has taken off elsewhere in the country, but not yet here in California. I think we have a fairly good sense about where these wins might be, these early wins that we can start to rely on in terms of pushing new products into the market. And so the Joint Institute has been really focused on, again, with those initial hypotheses, bringing groups together to advance market development. I take that as involving the relevant decision makers at state agencies. They have a lot of the regulatory sway that's important here. You need technology developers that are running around trying to develop projects and running into barriers to raise those barriers and to talk about how to overcome them. You need investors that are either willing to that either see a clear commercial interest or have a particular motivation for investing in resilience and in forested communities, and those can really trade off, of course, and work with each other. And then you need the off takers of this product to be in the room. If you're making hydrogen, for example, you might be selling it to a refinery in the Bay Area, and that's a different thing. Probably biomass power generators have never really thought about contracting with refineries. So I think it really takes putting all these people in the same room with an initial hunch that these could be markets that could develop, that could be profitable, and then a really just sober understanding of what those barriers are and how each of those groups need to work together in order to build this market. So we're starting that in the low carbon fuel space at the Joint Institute, and I think we have a lot of ideas again for take your pick: cellulosic nanocrystals, veneer manufacturing, mass plywood manufacturing. I mean, there's a lot of places that we could go, and we're hoping that again that this allows us to work as a state while also respecting community voices and really making sure they're empowered.
I really like that, because I think what you've put the emphasis on there is not only the community support, the entrepreneurial development, but also, and the finance, which we all know is really important, but also the need to invest in R&D, research and development. This is an iterative process. It's something which in the past with different technologies has received quite a bit of support. And we have almost nothing in terms of the development of wood products, innovative wood products. And I think that that's really important.
Yes. And Alyssa, one more thing I'll say on that. I think it's absolutely key that you have your off-taker in mind as you're developing these products, because that's where that's really where the rubber meets the road. I'm convinced that with supportive policy and motivated off-takers, that we can take the next step to commercialize these technologies at full scale. And what we've seen over and over again is that there's a little push to develop the action on the supply side, on the infrastructure side, and then these facilities build, they spend hundreds of millions of dollars, and then they don't have anyone to sell their fuel to, for example.
Got it.
And so that it's really bringing together an entire market in the state.
Yes, thank you. So Steve, I want to, yes, your hand is up, and I was just going to turn it over to you. So it's like, what is your vision for bringing this to scale? What, how do you see that, and what kind of support is needed?
Well, first we need to bring in the missing pieces of this from the Sierra. There's 3% of the people of California, less than that, live in the Sierra. We're not going to have and we're more poverty stricken than the rest of the state anyway. So we're never going to afford the level of investment on our own. So first, the people who use the water downstream, in our case, the East Bay, really need to be partners in the stewardship of their watersheds. And part of that is for investments to be coming from water users and other people who are using the resources of the Sierra to actually pay for the actual cost of what they're getting. A lot of these agreements went back 100 years and were kind of sellouts on the part of the people who owned the land in the Sierra, and wound up with very disadvantageous but permanent agreements that we're stuck with. I believe water agencies need to be partners. The water forest marriage needs to be consummated, and we need to get going in the ways that people in Denver and New York and the Hudson have already shown the way. We just need to replicate that. Secondly, we need investor incentives that will have people with money. I've been to Silicon Valley a number of times, and I've begged for money from all across the country. But the incentives for people to invest in the Sierra are not enough to even get these little 3 megawatt power plants going in the places of greatest need. And I actually think that this is a state, federal, and local problem, along with those other partners I've mentioned. Why isn't there a Tennessee Valley Authority kind of attention to the Sierra as we burn some of the greatest resources in the nation? Isn't there some idea that California alone can't handle this? Is there a federal intervention with state partnership and business partnership that can actually produce the resources necessary to get this done? It's a policy issue. It's a political issue. And the idea that government can work and that science is real seems to be under some level of challenge. But if we look to our history, and back 10,000 years for fire coming on the landscape as a healthy thing, or if we look at the Tennessee Valley Authority as something that really made a difference in an extreme poverty situation, we're no less in need here in California today. And the crisis is real. And it's going to require all of those pieces to be put in place by policymakers to really have us stop talking to ourselves and being Lemony Snicket's a series of unfortunate events. We've got to do better than that, and it's going to require bigger thinking.
Thank you. Jonathan, you want to give a shot to this? What's your vision, and what's needed to get there?
Dan used the word sober. I want to start there, and then I'll go to my enthusiasm in terms of where we're at. Sobering is when we're working to hire crews and we can't find local folks to work those jobs. Sobering is when my staff is volunteering to be science judges at the local science fair, and the kids are not turning on their screens and produce nothing because they've not been involved in school and they pretty much checked out. And sobering are the challenges of bandwidth, which they face all the time. I snickered a little bit when Secretary Crowfoot had some challenges where he is. We live that all the time in a lot of these rural areas. Bandwidth is really important. It's important for businesses to locate in these places. And in too many areas, it's just rotten. I'm optimistic. Oh, let me mention something else. And Tom Wheeler asked the question early on. just this housing issue to which Steve referred as well. Roughly half the people are paying more than a third of their income on rental prices, and there just is inadequate housing. I know that that's a statewide issue, but we're going to continue to be challenged by that if we do not address that head on. Okay, I'm excited. Never before have I seen the partners, the state, the federal agencies, local agencies, the university, and others coming together in the way that they are at this point. I think for those of us who have been in the trenches for as long as we have, it's not fast enough, but it's amazing. And it has really changed in the last few years, in part because of the work of the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, in part because of the resource agency, in part because of the state investment in the land. There is increasing recognition that if we don't simultaneously invest in the infrastructure, and I'm going to say the human capital as a part of that infrastructure and the physical capital, we will not succeed with our forest restoration goals. The $1 billion is a great down payment, as I've said before, and it's a great start. We have to simultaneously invest in the infrastructure needed to do this work. So it is the coming together, and I can't help but mention the collaboratives as a part of that work in forging pathways, forging relationships that weren't there as recently as 10 years ago, 15 years ago. So it's a different landscape, if you will, positive and negative. There's much to work on, and I'm actually quite bullish on where we're going and the opportunities that we have.
Thank you. I've been chatted that we have some good questions. So I'm going to turn this, ask Elliot to turn his screen on. And what do we have for the panelists?
Good morning. Yeah, we have a couple good questions for Steve. The first one here is, can you talk about the response of tribal groups to your model, to the CHIPS model? And then some more about how you initiate and manage the intertribal component. So does CHIPS coordinate, launch, and train crews with different communities and tribes? And specifically, the questioner, Bridget Fithian, would like to know more about how she may be able to engage with CHIPS in our communities.
Thank you for that question. We actually have a number of different models. One is CHIPS as the employer of record and taking responsibility for insurance and workers' comp and all the things that go with that. And that has been the model that we started with the formation of CHIPS involving 3 tribes and the development of the program. Since then, with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy grant and a couple of others, we have had the opportunity to expand our contacts, and it's resulted in several different models. For Big Sandy Mono Tribe, we were able through the grant to provide equipment and training for people who had been volunteering as trail builders for the last 15 years, and they wanted to expand to a forestry and restoration crew. We found joint contracts and we developed joint work, but that is a tribal enterprise. In another case up north with the Machupta tribe, we are starting as the employer of record, and we are developing jointly with the tribe a number of contracts which are currently underway in the Campfire Burn Scar. The model is intended to result in an enterprise for the tribal group, but it's going to take a while to develop the in-house management and administration of that. So we are currently the employer of record, but with the goal of transition. How you reach us is to call this number, area code 209-419-1919. I'm at the other end of that phone. And what we do is we meet with individual tribes that are interested in this and determine what is the model and capacity and the evolution of that. We also have a number of agreements that are as much as 5-year agreements to perform specific work and services and provide a certain amount of equipment and training during that period. So there are a lot of different styles and types of agreements. It all depends on the tribe's interests and wishes. self-governance and the idea, well, I should say, we believe in the independent right of each tribe to set its course. And we are also working in a couple of areas to try to develop a good neighbor agreement that would allow tribal workforces to work on lands adjacent to them, having been stolen from them, and ultimately have land repatriated. So that's a subject of great interest to us, and we are pursuing that in 2 areas.
Great, thanks, Steve. Sounds like a good opportunity for folks to follow up with you if they're interested in this. We had a follow-up question just really quickly, which I think could be a quick one we can answer. Do the tribes need to be federally recognized? And we hope not. So.
Actually, the first 3 tribes that were part of the formation of CHIPS and part of our executive board were non-recognized. And in fact, that was one of the problems. There are 2 issues. One is that there's very few resources and high unemployment in non-recognized tribal groups in California. And the attempts to gain recognition take years, decades, and they're happening at about 2 per year last I heard, and there are 180 some applications. So yes, we work with both recognized and non-recognized, but I will also say that the tribes that are recognized tend to have stronger infrastructure and the capacity to build up a workforce, but still face the issue in gambling tribes that most of the people have been in the criminal justice system, which is a majority in some cases of tribal youth, especially young men. Those folks are having a hard time, even in the federally recognized circumstances, of getting people employed. So we go way out of our way to try to make sure that constituency has an opportunity to get back in the swing of things economically.
Okay, thanks, Steve. I think that's an open invitation to follow up with Steve with other questions about intertribal partnership opportunities. Switching gears here really quickly, we have a question here from recently retired S&C employee, Lynn Campbell. I'm hearing that a constant feedstock is key to building and maintaining these forest products industries. How can we promise a constant supply from the forest to potential investors? So that's a key question I think a lot of us have been asking around this area.
Well, I can quickly answer that in our area, because of fire and bug kill, it has rained biomass on us, and it appears that every backyard is a log deck. That used to be an issue, but we don't see a whole lot of curtailment of that. The main issue and challenge for us is the transportation to the sites.
Yeah, and if I can step in a little bit, the feedstock question is an interesting one. It's a complicated one, and it's one that we need to really understand if we're going to make this work. As you are well aware, we have a kind of 3 tiers of gradation in terms of who owns forest land in California. A large portion of that is owned by large timber companies that pursue fairly vertically integrated strategies. That's going to require a different approach than, say, working with small private or non-industrial private forest owners who are also interested in forest restoration. And then, of course, we have added complexity and also some emerging opportunities around feedstock from Forest Service land. I am of the opinion that there are ways that the private sector can step in terms of contracting and advanced contracting structures that can likely help alleviate a lot of these issues with private forest owners. What may be necessary, however, for working with the Forest Service, though, is state-sponsored or state-organized entities, and there are a variety of those that are out there that could serve this role that might be able to provide a little bit more certainty and a little bit more aggregation in the market, especially when working with, as Steve said, hopefully a revitalized, expanded, and newly restoration-focused Forest Service in the state.
Elliot, we have time for, Jonathan, go ahead.
Very quick response. 2 ways of looking at that we often identify. One, the folks who want to finance projects that are going to use a lot of material, they need a surety. They need contracts. Those folks who are working on the ground regularly see massive amount of wood, as Steve identified. So there are 2 really different orientations to that. In response to Dan's point, one of the things that the Sierra Institute is exploring, and as are other groups, is the idea of nonprofits and other entities actually selling wood off of Forest Service land, putting money back into the land and analyses to keep a pipeline of material flowing.
Okay, and we're going to dive a little bit more into financing and things like that in our next panel. So stick around, Lynn and other folks, if that's still top of mind. I have another question here from Carrie Timmer, Sierra Business Council. I think this gets to a little bit of the conversation we started off with on scale, and I'll just read it out here from her. It seems like there may be a growing focus by key state agencies on the production of low/no carbon biofuel products, likely in facilities located in the Sac-San Joaquin Valley. How do we ensure that such a focus doesn't take the attention away from the need for community scale biomass infrastructure in near forested communities to make local forest restoration more economically viable, and especially to provide local community benefits that would be lost if forest restoration byproduct material is sent elsewhere?
Sure, and I'll jump in very quickly. I think this is one of those questions that keeps me up at night. We have seen actually a lot of momentum, particularly in the Central Valley of California, to use waste agricultural biomass to produce low carbon, no carbon, or zero carbon fuels. We even saw a facility announced last week, a company called Clean Energy Systems that is going to buy a 300 ton per day biomass plant in Mendota, right in the middle of the Central Valley. And they want to make electricity to run electric vehicles, capture all the carbon associated with that, and stick it underground. That is exactly the kind of model and the kind of innovation and the kind of technological deployment that we need in the state. The real question is going to be, how do we make sure this works for forested communities? And there's a lot of hard questions there. Which fuel are we going to make? At what scale are we going to make it? Who are we going to sell it to? What is the kind of the right size here? Are these facilities taking in 50 tons of biomass? Are they taking, per hour? Are they taking in, 200 tons of biomass per hour? Are they taking in a lot more than that? I think this all really needs to be worked out. So not to give answers, just to say that the tension is real.
May I respond to that quickly? Part of this is really about the vision that those who are funding these activities have. It's a state, federal, and other kind of perspective. Manuel Pastor, in his Cal Forward opening statement, talked about a reimagining. So too did E.J. Dion in a recent book, talked about reimagining relationships. It's time to reimagine forest and watershed restoration work, where we talk about investing in these upper watersheds and having some of those dollars go to the restoration practices and the infrastructure to do that work. This reimagining has to involve the timber industry. It's central to the work. It has to envision rural forest communities and tribes deeply embedded in natural resource stewardship, and the role of both working with the environmental community in the restoration of forests and watersheds and carbon smart projects. That's where we're going. That's the vision that we need to really work on. Collaboratives are leading the way in many respects. So too, Sierra Nevada Conservancy, but we need to continue to broaden and deepen this work and keep reminding folks of this vision.
So we have 2 minutes. I don't know if we have any appropriate questions, Elliot. One more question.
Let me see. So I do have one. So we have a Q&A from David Griffith. I think that's for folks to check out about sort of the different costs and benefits of different activities that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I want to go to one of our board members, Paul Rowan. Why is there not a focus on utilizing current infrastructure that sits idle? So, and then after that, I think if there's a couple of small questions, if the panelists have a chance to type a quick answer, that would be great. Otherwise, we can follow, but we can try to connect folks later on if they don't get their questions answered.
I'll briefly on utilizing current infrastructure that's societal. I think it's a key question. It's a key part of what this transition strategy needs to be. Jonathan likely has a lot more to say about that. Whether this is in existing idle biomass power plants, which is what we're actually seeing being repurposed and reused for this negative emissions electricity in the Central Valley of California. Clean Energy Systems is trying to buy four existing and shuttered and idled biomass power plants. I think the same logic applies to doing this in the Sierras or in rural communities outside of the Central Valley.
Thanks. Jonathan, if you have a real quick answer, and then we have to go to break.
We're not interested in walking away from existing facilities and utilization activities, but we are interested in building, again, at community scale. There's a lot of facilities that are using material, but we know that what we have out there needs more, not less, needs more than what we currently have. And again, as I've already said, this opportunity to rebuild rural economies with some new infrastructure that in no way, shape, or form is going to compromise the existing infrastructure that's out there.
Thanks, everybody. I'm going to send us to break now, but I'd like to really sincerely thank our panelists for being here and talking in such a meaningful way about the issues and your visions for the future. We're going to go to break now. We'll come back at 10:45.
Hi, welcome back, everybody. We're going to jump into our next panel now. This panel is going to be moderated by Sierra Nevada Conservancy's regional forester, Elliot Vanderkolk. And we're going to talk a little bit, Elliot and our panelists are going to talk a little bit about how we should, opportunities to grow the restoration economy. So welcome, panelists, and Elliot, over to you.
Thanks, Angie. I hope everyone had a good chance to stretch their legs and caffeinate as needed. As Angie mentioned, my name is Elliot Vanderkolk. I'm the regional forester here, and we'll be moderating this panel. So the first speakers and the panel before us laid out a vision for the restoration economy with some great examples of programs they're working on right now in our region and beyond. And to grow this vision, I think we'll really need resources, public partnerships, and innovation to really get us there. I don't think it's something that's going to happen on its own. So for this panel, we're joined by 3 experts in economic development, entrepreneurial support, and social and environmental impact finance to discuss the barriers to growing a restoration economy in the Sierra Nevada and how we can build the right tools and the relationships to overcome them. Like the first panel, please use the Q&A box for questions. If you see a question you like, feel free to upvote it. This will help Elisa out. We hope to get to those towards the end of the panel. So next I'll go and introduce our panelists, and then we'll dive into some of the questions. So in alphabetical order, Dan Adler is a senior advisor for climate finance to the Governor's Office for Business and Economic Development, or GoBiz, and the Infrastructure and Economic Development Bank, the iBank. Prior to this role, he was vice president for policy at the Energy Foundation, a partnership of philanthropies advancing clean energy markets across the U.S. He has deep experience in clean energy finance, as well as overseeing the California's Renewable Portfolio Standard at the Public Utilities Commission. Zach Knight is co-founder and CEO of Blue Forest. Prior to founding Blue Forest, he started his career in finance at Merrill Lynch, where he specialized in structured finance. He also served as a high yield and distressed corporate bond trader before leaving Wall Street to pursue an MBA at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business with a focus on sustainability and environmental investing. And Kristen York is the Vice President of Economic Empowerment at the Sierra Business Council. She directs the Sierra Small Business Development Center and Economic Development District for SBC, where she leverages 25 years of experience in strategic planning, finance, operations, and organizational change to assist communities and businesses to thrive economically while understanding their environmental and social impact. She also serves on the board of the Truckee Tahoe Community Foundation. So Kristen, let's start out with you. You and the Sierra Small Business Development Center work with many small businesses. What do businesses need to thrive in the restoration economy, and how can government and philanthropy help these entrepreneurs succeed as we start to grow it?
Great, thank you, Elliot. So at a baseline level, businesses really need 5 things to thrive. Any business: solid market demand, reliable material supply, available and trained workforce, access to capital, and I would argue technical assistance to ensure the business can grow and thrive. And these elements are even more important in the restoration economy because we're dealing with sensitive and sometimes remote ecological environments in rural communities. And it's for this reason that both government and philanthropy have an important role. So let me explain. Philanthropic dollars, by their nature, can be catalytic and take risks that public money and traditional investors will not tolerate. And at the end of the day, any successful business venture is about speed and scale. So government or public dollars driven by policy guidelines cannot take the same kind of risks. So there's a role for each category of capital in the table, at the table to attract private capital for investment. And to be honest, investment in a small timber mill, for example, cannot really compete with the multiples of a typical Silicon Valley investment, and nor would it have the ability to scale at that level. So it's important to acknowledge that up front, manage expectations, and place a value on the co-benefits of environmental restoration, social equity, and rural community development.
Thanks, Kristen. Sorry, I was taking a couple notes there. And Dan, over to you. I'd be curious. You're have a recent entree into this sector, and I'm curious what you see as the main financial barriers facing the next generation of businesses that will utilize low and no value wood, and what tools does the iBank or GoBiz have to assist those businesses to enter that market and to grow in the restoration economy?
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. Thank you for the chance to join you today. It's been a really rich conversation so far, and I'm really glad I tuned into the first panel. I picked up a lot of tips and things I want to follow up on with the experts that you've collected. So my background has been sort of toggling back and forth for the last 20 years across public sector, capital provider, and philanthropic approaches to climate solutions. And one thing that's led me to conclude, or at least have a thesis around, is capital comes in obviously many different forms. And we've heard a few times today about the various demands of different forms of capital. And here we are in the Bay Area trying to get Silicon Valley engaged in stewardship and climate solutions. And Silicon Valley has a certain equity-driven high multiples model that I really don't think we're ever going to achieve, at least in most cases. There may be some core piece of intellectual property that unlocks the hydrogen economy and can be deployed in forest stewardship. And that might make a 10x return from somebody, and we should look for that. But what's missing is a participatory form of capital that is publicly aligned, but equally disciplined as private investors are, in not just making a grant and backing off, or making a grant here and moving to another place and making a grant. Grants are critical, and the state will continue to make grants for a range of climate needs. We have 40 plus grant making programs in the state that are trying to do something useful in the climate agenda. And those will continue, but they'll hopefully become more coordinated and aimed at certain aspects of the developmental challenge specific to a project and specific to a project on the ground. And so when we were looking around early on in the Newsom administration, and I had the chance to provide some advice during the campaign from my seat at the Energy Foundation about a new form of public finance that could be brought to bear, we modeled what we ultimately suggested in the form of the Catalyst Fund off of state level green banks and national green banks that are now more than a decade old. There's 12 or so states that have something like a green bank in play. California is not one of them, ironically. And they're active at an international scale. Japan's got one, Australia, the UK. And their mission is to layer in some amount of public capital that wants to get its money back, but is trying to unlock the market by participating at an earlier stage of development, so taking more risk there, and or providing capital at a lower return than the private markets will, to lower the cost of the project. Because certainly in this sector, we're very aware that the margins are very thin and the cost of capital can be hugely significant from the standpoint of the viability of the outcome. So money matters, but the kind of money and how it participates matters more. So to your direct question, Elliot, what are we trying to do explicitly with the Catalyst Fund here? And the brief version, and I'm happy to get into it more, is to meet the projects on the ground where they are. Because we know anytime you're doing something hard, if it's not community owned and community driven, community specified, then it's not going to fly. When there's so many different risks associated with this work that are not financial in terms of feedstock supply, offtake. It's not really in the confines of the balance sheet. So we need all the local support and buy-in, and we want to be supporting that as it matures. And we want to be the cheap capital, but not the dumb capital. We want to be low cost to drive down the overall cost of the project, take some developmental risks off the table, and then turn to partner with private money at scale and say, look, these projects are ready to go. They're owned by the community. They're unique, but they are sufficiently standardized. And that's a key point. You have to think about these things as a program where we might be able to take the $50-odd million that the governor's proposed in our budget, which is not a lot, and put it into a program as opposed to just a series of one-off investments. That can be for advanced energy, that can be for advanced building materials, but it has to be standardized, programmatized, so that we can move at the pace we need and use the state's intervention in the form of the Catalyst Fund to significantly increase the amount of private capital that comes alongside. That's the theory. If we have the good success in the governor's budget and landing these funds, that's how we're going to approach the market. But I'll say again, we know we won't get anywhere near the level of success we need without the kinds of partnerships that you all are pulling together today.
Great, thanks. And Zach, let's go over to you really quick. So maybe you can help tell us a little bit about what your organization does, and then, I think it's pretty innovative in how it is able to align partners and money to implement projects really on the ground. So to go down to the nuts and bolts of the restoration economy, doing work in the forest and then vital stewardship work. So how are you translating some of our need to do forest work into something that people want to invest in? And then what are some of the financial barriers that you think you've encountered, and how you can potentially overcome them through engaging private investors?
Great. Thank you, Elliot. And thanks for having me. SNC has been such a great partner to Blue Forest since really our beginning. And just an honor to speak at the WIP today and share some of this with you all. So what you've heard a little bit about so far in this panel and a little bit in the last panel is investing in infrastructure, traditional infrastructure, built infrastructure, bioenergy facilities, other things of that nature. But I want folks that are listening to this to also think about the projects, the restoration, the ecological restoration projects that we need to have done on both federal land and state responsibility area land. And at the end of the day, these forests and watersheds, as we saw in AB 2480 from 2016, are natural infrastructure. And we should look to finance these projects as if we were financing any bit of gray infrastructure. And it makes a lot of sense because in the United States, there's trillions of dollars invested in infrastructure. So we need to take something like investing in these projects and make it feel and look ultimately boring to investors to really get money going. So what does this look like? Our firm, Blue Forest, has pioneered the Forest Resilience Bond in partnership with the U.S. Forest Service and the World Resources Institute. And in short, what this is a public-private partnership that allows private investors, perhaps from insurance companies, pension plans, but also foundations, to cover the upfront costs of doing this work to accelerate the pace and scale of these restoration treatments, and then allow all the beneficiaries of this work, of a healthy watershed, to join in paying those investors back over time. And those beneficiaries obviously include federal land managers like the Forest Service, but they can also include state agencies, water and electric utilities, flood control districts, and even private companies. And I think we heard a bit about this on the last panel, so I want to touch on this. There's a need to bring new dollars to the table. I think everybody in this space is incredibly grateful for the commitment that the state of California makes to healthy forests. We work in other states, and California puts out more money than every other Western state we work in combined, so we're very thankful for that. That said, we have a much bigger problem as well. And a lot of our work is actually engaging and bringing in some of the other groups that benefit to put their dollars on the table and really make those investments, as we heard Dr. Jonathan Kuzel and Steve Walensky talking about in the last panel. And the way that we do that is by actually working with these groups to understand what are the ecosystem services, what are the positive benefits conferred by a healthy watershed, and then working directly with those stakeholders and the World Resources Institute to understand what are these benefits actually worth to you? If we did protect the forest, if we were able to avoid sedimentation, enhance flows, avoid air quality issues, or other things of that nature, what might that be worth to other stakeholders? And ultimately, that's what we finance. All of these stakeholders make long-term commitments, which allow us to make a lot more money available on day one, which is absolutely critical for a handful of reasons. If we want to get bigger projects and we want to scale some of this up, we need more money to do that, obviously. And financing is a big key part of that because many folks can't make large single-year commitments to this work in the same way that the state of California can. The other piece of this that I think is really important here is understanding how to bring those stakeholders to the table and put that money into a way that makes sense for all the stakeholders to use it. The state is great at giving out things like reimbursable grants, but they pose great challenges to the tribes, to the NGOs, to the RCDs that use that funding, because often it can take the state up to 6 months to make those payments out to those groups. So if we want to hire local contractors and we want to pay folks when work's done, financing can be an important part of solving that problem. At Blue Forest, we launched our first Forest Resilience Bond in 2018 in the Yuba River Ranger District on the Tahoe National Forest. It was a small $4 million project, but we're excited because this year we're launching the second phase of that, which will be larger than $20 million on that same ranger district, on the same forest, with all of the same partners as that first project. And we'll be looking to bring this mechanism to other watersheds across the state of California as well.
Okay, so earlier we had a question about this, and I thought I'd bring it up. And Zach, I don't know if you want to go first on this one, or we can go do a round robin here. But we often look at new wood products businesses as a chicken and the egg scenario, or we want them to help accelerate forest health work by offsetting some of the treatment costs, but then industry is looking for more supply certainty. So how can we, any thoughts on how we start to bridge this gap? How do we work on sort of both sides and align actors to work on this? It sounds like Blue Forest is doing a lot of work in aligning those folks to provide necessary working capital, a little more certainty. I'm just curious if you could start with this, and then maybe we can go back to Dan and Kristen after that.
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. So what we're really trying to avoid is, I don't know if folks are aware of this, but there are hundreds of thousands of burn piles sitting all across our national forests in California. And getting those piles burned actually takes fire resources away from doing prescribed fire broadcast burn, more things that we want to see on the forest to rejuvenate that natural fire cycle. So what we're hoping to see happen in these projects is actually take some of those burn piles, especially the larger ones, and get them transported to bioenergy facilities and wood product campuses, which is really the state's vision for how this can work. One of the main challenges that we've run into, because we work almost exclusively on federal land, is how can the Forest Service make multi-year commitments of supply to those stakeholders? And the short answer is through cooperative agreements, how most of these projects are implemented, they really can't. So we thought about it and we said, well, for the groups on the ground that work with the Forest Service, like the National Forest Foundation, the Great Basin Institute, the National Wild Turkey Federation, any of these high capacity groups that the state writes grants to, and the Forest Service chooses to be an implementation partner, these groups could be ones that could start to guarantee that supply if we can address two risks. The first risk is obviously what we saw last year, wildfire burning down projects and burning down that supply. Often in the contracting world, that can be addressed with a material adverse change or a force majeure clause, so it's not that big of a risk. The other piece that's a much larger risk is that federal funding for this comes out in one-year increments, and lots of these projects that don't have big chunks of state funding fail or they stop moving forward because of lack of federal appropriations. In our model, in the Forest Resilience Bond, if we're actually able to get all the stakeholders to the table signing contracts, we could have fully funded projects with access to all that financing on day one, which really takes the risk away from some of those groups and trying to guarantee some of that supply to these groups that could be off takers and could really reduce the need to do all that pile burning in the forest.
So what I'm hearing there is not necessarily firm, long, multi-year stewardship contracts, but potentially partnerships that allow the private sector to kind of provide some certainty and to market as it grows, right? And Dan, what do you think? I mean, I'm curious. You're talking about the Catalyst Fund potentially, and I think you mentioned there's about 40 different grant programs working to work on this. How do we align all those together to start working to handle this piece? And what do you think they need to hear on the supply side, or as we start building market development as well, start connecting those two dots potentially?
Yeah, and to be clear, the 40 different programs are across the state's climate agenda broadly. And so when we set up the Catalyst Fund last year, it was meant to be a sort of general purpose infrastructure fund that could lend to private actors, direct lending, credit support, conduit financing, special purpose, the whole range of tools that private sector uses, but don't really exist in a state sort of policy bank. So we created that tool set, and one of the goals is to better coordinate capital in the form of the Catalyst Fund with two other critical components that sit above the iBank at the level of GOBIZ, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development. And those two are equally relevant as the money, I would say. One is deep sector knowledge. So in the governor's proposal is a dedicated person at GOBIZ. I know it's only one, but they will spend all day working on the on-the-ground issues associated with the process of pre-development, the local permitting, the relationship with the stakeholders and landowners, engagement across all the governmental agencies that have touch. That deep sector knowledge has to be in place before we can unlock markets and make progress. That's true for all climate infrastructure. It's crucial in this area. And then the third pillar is all the stuff that needs to happen behind the scenes so government works better, state to state, state to local, state to federal. If there's a bucket of grant money, say over at CAL FIRE, and we're in a great place with them now setting up the loan program and their existing and going forward grants to target areas of pre-development that basically would show up like equity in a project, but be funded with grants to get a project ready for a loan from iBank, a program at the treasurer's office, or even better, just a direct engagement from private borrowers. So it's those three pillars: capital, sector knowledge, and governmental coordination that we're leaning on. But on the front end, we know that we can't get anything like what we need to get done without rationalizing feedstock. Is it the case that we need 10-year feedstock agreements for advanced energy product? Maybe, maybe not. We need to get to a place where we can really test that with project developers and capital providers and say, let's push on that a little bit. Would 5 years do? Or can we just widen the ambit of intake so that it's actually not about a fixed feedstock from one place, but you have access to more sources of feedstock such that you're comfortable taking that risk as the developer and the financier? I don't feel like we're close enough to those questions as a state, certainly not yet, although we've done good work in the last year. Our effort really is to put some resources into that. In addition to the person, the governor's budget contains funds for pilot projects in feedstock aggregation, using parlance like the X Prize to really try and do some novel stuff, and then connect that to the marketplace and to local community-driven projects and see what works, and then have a story about what can scale based on real market traction. It's not a place, obviously, where the state has a lot of experience in being a direct participant in the market, but I think given the time we have and the urgency, we have to get closer to it.
And Kristen, curious to hear your thoughts on this. I mean, I think you're wearing two hats. You also are a board member at the Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation. So curious, does philanthropy play a role here, or how do we help those small businesses to get over this hump with supply and potentially work on market demand too? I think that would be a good question for you as well. I think you're on mute right now.
Swore I wasn't going to do that. But we really have to look at this holistically. And I love Zach's answer. Dan's is inspiring. And I love the fact that he came from the private sector into the public sector. And this is a unique problem. I'm going to answer from my perspective as an implementer with a long history in the private sector and sometimes deep frustration with the public sector. In full disclosure, I'm a huge Zach Knight and Blue Forest Conservation fan because they attack this problem by thinking differently. It really reminds me of that Henry Ford quote: if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. So really, this is about, to me, thinking backwards from the solution. So really having the end in mind here. We have the scientific papers. I know Dan Sanchez is probably like, no, we don't have them all, but we have so much information. I'm not well, never mind. We have the scientific papers and we have the government studies, and now we need to prove the concept, which is what Zach is doing, right? We have a call to action with the California Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan, and we also have idle facilities in rural communities waiting to start up again, as Paul Rohn pointed out. They're all over California. So there's this practice in the entrepreneurial community called minimum viable product, where you move forward with an idea and you're prepared to pivot when your hypotheses are proved wrong. It can be difficult to do with multi-million-dollar infrastructure investments. It can be very difficult to do when you have public funding, but that's where philanthropic funding can come in. It's worth a shot because you move the ball forward, right? We have a decision to make in California. With every fire season, do we want to be giving to recovery and relief efforts, or would we rather invest in the systems change is required to make a difference? And would we rather have healthy forests and resilient communities, or be relying on FEMA to bail us out? I personally think the answer is clear. We anecdotally know the feedstock is there. Putting pilots on the ground is the fastest way to prove concept.
Okay, perfect. So, I mean, I think that's a great point. We had Zach talking about, hey, we want to make this boring to investors, right? And Kristen, I heard you say we're not capturing the value of all the co-benefits, and to make this it's not going to compete with an investment in a large sawmill potentially if we're trying to invest in a small log mill or a campus, as we've talked about today. So where's the tension here, and how do we tell the story well and integrate some of the do some of the integration work that Zach has been great at, but also make it a boring investable product that we can help scale. So I'm curious for Kristen or Dan to weigh in on the tension between making it boring and making it and sexy.
I'm going to I'm going to translate boring into reduced risk. Okay. And that's what he's really talking about. How do you reduce risk? You come in with that layer of funding, and Dan mentioned it. I mean, what they're trying to do with the Catalyst Fund at the state of California, although I love the whole idea of dumb money. I want to dive deeper into that at some point. But staying away from the dumb money. The investors, they're a mile away from that. The investors' private money is the smart money. But so is philanthropic, because it's mission-based, and no philanthropic organization would put their money into any project that wasn't aligned with their mission. And government is going to look at those co-benefits as well. So, I really get back to, I think moving on these pilot projects, these minimum viable product, that needs to be a priority, and place-based solutions can test and innovate. You can come back to the state to help structure further policy. We really need to take a holistic approach to the ecosystem of solutions. This is, and the other thing is, this came up earlier, but this is not a rural issue at all. Sierra region alone provides 60% of the water to California. We support agriculture, manufacturing, and urban development. Sierra is a source of food and timber and clean air, energy generation, and very importantly, recreation, major component of our economy. So we're talking about co-benefits. It's also for the state at large and our economy. And we need to increase the resources and assets available to this region, not just from the communities where we log and create energy and recreate, but from our populated urban communities as well. There's a clear role for philanthropy there. Things move much faster on the ground and in the private sector, and we need to grow the pie so that the on-the-ground partners can move faster. Projects like the Loyalton biomass facility, or it's right near Zach's project, literally, it's right down the hill from it. The Camptonville, little tiny 3 megawatt plant, or Steve Walensky's projects. These are the projects on the ground that could move fast with the right investment, but they require a mixed capital stack, and philanthropy and government totally have a role there.
Yeah, I really think the notion of obviously a holistic view is critical. That gets kind of tossed around, but really thinking about the continuum of development and the package of interventions, particularly from the public sector, that need to be brought to bear. You mentioned feedstock, critical, but it's really kind of one piece. And I've got in my mind three parts of the equation. The end point being demand signals and demand drivers, but I'll get to that in a second. I really love the campus model and the notion of anchoring your economic development strategy on something that has current economics, but then being deliberate about how you extend the ambit of economic activity from there. That's a great theory, and I think it can work. We have to get really specific about the cash flows and the business interests that are implicated. If your anchor is in a combustion biomass electricity facility, okay, so you've got a contract. Maybe you don't. Maybe you're repowering. There's a lot of stuff going on in that issue set to do with local air quality, your local utility, the price of power versus other renewables. Unpack that, then maybe you've got the pillar of your, kind of your tent, the pole. And then from there, you're going to produce advanced energy products. Exactly how? Whose money comes in there? How do you standardize it so that if there's a venture investor that's got a nice piece of technology, they need field deployment, then you've kind of de-risked and made it, that's not boring ever in the venture world, but you've made it easier for them to slot in their capital and their technology in that campus framework. And you could say the same thing about building materials, on and on. But that's really deep sort of transactional detail that we need if we're going to make this campus idea, reality and a reproducible reality. And I think we're all in for that work. And then lastly, on the demand signals, we mentioned repowering existing facilities, do that where we can, respecting local air quality and community sentiment in that regard. But what else can we do with the state's power to set market conditions, either with its own procurement or incenting private actors to purchase energy products or construction materials that are coming out of this new economic development strategy, industrial policy, if you like? What does that policy invention need to look like? Nobody else can do that. There's no actor other than government that can step in and make that happen. Can we have offtake agreements that we facilitate or directly anchor for hydrogen, for advanced liquid fuels, for construction materials? If we're really entering a phase of getting serious about our housing crisis, can we take advantage of that need to anchor the supply and the kind of the value stream coming out of the forest for advanced materials and couple this solution to the nature of the housing crisis that we're facing and continue to wrestle with. That's a role for the state that nobody else other than the state can step in and do that. So rationalize supply, organize the campus, send a durable demand signal across the products you want. Maybe that's a theory that we can grow into.
So Dan, you mentioned a bunch about the campus approach, and that's been floating around in our world for a long time. And I think a lot of folks are interested in it and want to pursue it. Kristen or Dan, I'm curious, and Zach, feel free to weigh in as well. We've run into some struggles there just with, again, it's sort of like, what's the anchor facility and how do we align partners? Because someone that may be an expert in running a utility scale bioenergy facility may not be the same people that can run a sawmill or can make cellulosic nanocrystals, or whatever your innovative product may be. So I'm just curious how, Kristen, if you have experience, I know you've been working a lot at Loyalton and thinking about some of these issues. So just curious, how do we align? How do we get those partners in the room together? What does it take? And how do we overcome some of that inertia we've been experiencing in the campus model?
A lot of them are in the room together, but they do require technical assistance to understand just what Dan was saying, that sort of the transactional detail for how these businesses can succeed. Some of them are very low margin businesses, so they're having a very difficult time attracting investors. But the synergies are around the raw material, right? That's what the synergy is around. It's not about what they're producing. Loyalton is a fantastic example. You've got several hundred acres. You have an existing lumber mill. You have an operable, nearly 20 megawatt biomass plant that, the challenges there are supply and then power purchase agreements and that whole value chain. But as long as wood is being delivered there, right? It can be sorted into, perhaps timber for resale, but the small diameter, the rest can be chipped. There's waste, heat, and power that can be used by other potential tenants at that campus. There's the biochar byproduct. So you really have to look at the entire value chain. So there's a vertical aspect and a horizontal aspect in terms of using every single piece of the tree. That the cellulosic potential is unbelievable. So it's really the synergy is in the wood.
Yeah, I guess I'm just curious a little bit to follow up on who can help play that matchmaker, right? I mean, I think we just haven't found. I hope that wood will be the synergy and the glue that brings them all together, and I think the economics make a lot of sense. It's just who's the right matchmaker?
Honestly, that activity is going on. Sierra Business Council has been out there working on that. The Tahoe Truckee Community Foundation is a convener. I mean, that's what we do. We convene parties through our forest salons and working directly. The Tahoe Fund is they've actually started playing a role. The Sierra Nevada Conservancy is a convener. So I think maybe it's formalizing what the approach is. We've got different things. We have a layout of that campus, right? We have a design for that campus. We have done whole studies on who potential tenants are. So it's probably just taking that to the next step. The thing I hate most is doing a study or doing a report and leaving it on the shelf. I think everybody hates that. Putting that into action.
Yeah, I think I'd echo all that, certainly on the sort of death by pilot or study process. But who can bring forward any kind of durable demand commitment for the product in question, facilitated by a local partner or some sort of development authority that we could create, or existing capacities within state government that would say, we believe in advanced liquid fuels as part of our transportation agenda. And we have some partners outside of the forest community, say in sustainable aviation, that are really interested in making some serious moves, or serious moves in the relative timescale. Are they going to be able to put capital on the table to anchor an offtake agreement? And what is the necessary state relationship to connect those parties together? Then you've got durable cash flows for not just the kind of immediate economics of traditional biomass electricity generation, but you're pushing that the economic viability out another rung or another couple of rungs to the other products that the campus is going to make. If that's facilitated by the local community groups, a development authority or a state entity, I think all those solutions, all those actors need to be considered. But I feel like that's an important functionality. Who's going to enable the durable demand signal for something that this feedstock can produce?
Yeah, I was struck by when Nils was talking, the length of time and really the strategic investment that of time and human capital that was made for that, that has really made a success in the Valley. And this is not, there's no quick fix here. We've been at this for quite a while, but this does take a lot. This takes patient capital. It takes an investor to come in and say, you know, I'm good with 20 years. That's really hard to find because a lot of times they want to match the, you know, on the demand side, they want to match those contracts, certainly in power, to the length of investment. And, you know, there's some work around that as well.
Yeah, great. And so I think we'll go, and maybe Zach, you can kick us off on this next question. So we heard earlier from Secretary Crowfoot about the shared stewardship agreement between the state of California and the federal government and the Forest Service on, you know, scaling up to 1 million acres a year being treated in the state. And we have some pilots scattered across. We have great programs we heard about on our last panel. How do we really start to scale this? And I think there's the tension and a trade-off potentially between some of the economies of scale that Dan Sanchez talked about in our first panel and doing things at community scale. So I'm just curious, Zach, for you to start off with, how do we take your model and some other approaches and get us to that goal that we have? Like, what's going to be the role that you see and that the private sector can play, as well as how the state can help support that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one term we haven't heard yet in all these answers is talking about blended capital. And what does that mean? Well, that means bringing some of the philanthropic capital or capital that can take concessional returns and mixing that in with market rate investors to unlock more of this. So I wanted to call that out as I think a first really important step. Our strategy, Elliot, which has been largely informed by the strategy of the state and the strategy of the U.S. Forest Service, is to say, how can we start with a pilot project in one of these critical watersheds, maybe at the headwaters, maybe not, and then with the same stakeholders, with the same contracts, with the same investment vehicle, with the same investors, can we then start to scale something like that up to provide more and more access to financing to those groups that are actually doing the work, the general contractors on the ground that on behalf of the Forest Service or other state agencies are actually hiring the folks to do the work in the woods here. The reason I think this is the right time for it is when we think about things from a financing perspective, we're still at historically low interest rates. We have an enormous chunk of ecological restoration that we need to do across the state of California and frankly, across the Western US. And it's never going to be cheaper to do than it is right now. And I think that should be one of the motivating factors here. Now, as we start to scale up, it's often not funding that's a challenge. As we talked about, the state puts a lot of money out. It's about finding the contractors and the local folks and building that local restoration economy. And what that requires in a lot of cases is longer term contracts. Now, I'm not talking about feedstock contracts. What I'm talking about is making more capital available, again, to these groups that are hiring these contractors and saying, we don't want you out here for just one field season. We want you out here for the next 5 field seasons, and this is what the work's going to look like. We can make this commitment now so that you businesses can start to scale up, hire the people that you need, do those kind of things and be ready. We're only going to do a little bit of work this year. It's going to be more next year, more the year after that. And by giving those signals to all the participants in the marketplace, it makes investments in those businesses less risky. And it provides a lot more capacity to the system, meaning that the state's investments in forest health are also less risky. You're going to have less grants that are sitting around unable to be utilized because of a lack of contract or lack of project readiness or anything of that nature. So I think it's really critical to look at it in that way of how do we use the financing that we can put together to send signals to the marketplace so that other investors, both market rate investors, but also philanthropy and concessional investors can start to make the investments that they need to make this work together. So it's very much, I take a step, you take a step, I take another step, and we go through it that way.
I'm happy to go next here. I think, in addition to what has been said earlier, finding a way to attach this work to other existing or emerging value streams that, again, it's going to take some facilitation at the macro level, I think probably through policy intervention, but things like carbon values through, say, the iterations of the low carbon fuel standard, which is a very valuable stream of potential investment capital. It tends to show up late in the project. It's not something that is underwritten to. So if we can think about methodologies that specify the carbon value of the interventions here, both in terms of the stewardship and the end product, and use that to drive financing at the beginning, I firmly believe that that could be truly transformational here. And then we heard some very interesting commentary on the last panel about watershed stewardship and the valuation of that in other markets in Denver and New York. And what does that mean at the front end for capital formation for projects if we had a regime that was more sophisticated along those lines? I know that's a ton of work in itself, but those two sort of big ticket, future value oriented frames that we need to then reduce to capital at the project stage. I think there's some interesting examples there. And then the last piece is this notion around standardization, but with local characteristics. I was really moved by the idea that there are six groups out there working on bioenergy that was mentioned in the prior panel, but not working in isolation. They're subject to their local conditions and the local desire of the community, but they're trying to do things that share common features. And in my decade in finance, there's no substitute for that. You know, somebody will burn the brain cells as an investor figuring out the first messy transaction if they think in so doing they can do 10 more that are more or less the same. But if it's just burnt toast every time for 10 times straight, then no, it's not going to happen, particularly at this scale. So that partnership that is locally conditioned, locally owned, but has the sophistication to say these 5 features are more or less identical, that's how you really drive scale.
Kristen, curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, I have a couple thoughts. One, I was really encouraged to hear Jonathan Kusel say, you know, he's seeing more energy around this now than he has in 20 years. So, you know, Jonathan's been doing this pretty much longer than anybody. So that was super encouraging. And then I wanted to address, there was something that came up in Q&A or chat about, you know, maybe a lot of these small communities don't, like, we have to define what scale is. So nobody is talking about coming in and creating, you know, coming into a small rural community and blowing it up, right? What they're talking about is reinvigorating these communities. We have there's hundreds of mills in California that just shut down. The counties and the communities we're talking about have aging populations, they have declining populations. The youth leave, they don't come back. So it's really about reinvigorating, looking at how you can holistically do that. How can maybe you use infrastructure in place, provide jobs for people that want to stay and live there, maybe attract some new people to come, but no one's talking about blowing up a community. That's not what's on the table here. It's really about helping sustain that community so that you know, it doesn't die off.
Great. And Dan, I wanted to go back to you for 1 second. I think, you know, at least at our agency, I think a lot of state agencies are pretty comfortable making grants. And, you know, Zach was talking about blended capital, and you spoke a little bit earlier about, blended finance and sort of trying to get that. How can the state get comfortable with the idea that we're actually, we're putting money into the private sector that has risk, and how do we start to underwrite those? And how do we think about the role, shifting the role of the state a little bit to enable, to expand our tool chest to include something that we don't typically do? And is it okay if we fail? I mean, it seems like we might fail, right? So
it's a great question. And, you know, tolerance for failure has to be there. You have to be willing to accept that, but still use standard underwriting practices. And, you know, at the end of the day, what this is about is taking the skills, techniques, and approaches of the State Infrastructure Bank, which is now 25 years old, has motivated tens of billions of dollars across loans, guarantees, conduit financing for public sector borrowers. So high credits, pretty transparent, you know, good kind of recourse to cash flows. That's an underwriting approach. It's fairly straightforward. And now we're taking over to private borrowers for policy-driven purposes in the climate sustainability sectors. Very different exposure, very different sense of who the counterparty is and where the cash is coming from. But the underwriting approach is, you know, it's just expanding, right? It's not wholly new. You just need to educate yourself and take the risk. So it's not without challenge from like a sort of state capacity perspective, but the iBank teams are ready to do it and aware that this is a key piece of kind of the evolution of it. We were fortunate to have the Catalyst Fund created in statute last year. Originally, it was going to be fairly significantly capitalized, but we went ahead and did it anyway in the COVID crisis, anticipating, this year and the federal stimulus coming. So we have the capacity to do that kind of private lending, which is necessarily high risk. It doesn't mean that we're going to be out there casting money about, and it will be a disciplined approach. But the tools and techniques, particularly in loan guarantees, which are backstopping a private party to really get close to the work, understand it, and hopefully not need the guarantee over time because now they're in it. Now they understand this business and they want to do it themselves. So I don't want to underplay the challenge, but iBank exists. It's got a great track record, and this is a compelling evolution of its model.
And Zach, I'm going to just do one quick follow-up because you've probably had the same sort of some similar things where the Forest Service has come to you and said, well, how is this all working? And I'm just curious if you have any advice for Dan or for other folks as we start to think about the right role for the private sector to play in this and how we move it forward. So that's just sort of the last, just curious how you've overcome some of those potential, challenges or questions that have arisen.
Sure. And I want to say I can't speak on behalf of the Forest Service, but in conversations with extremely high-level leadership there, this is one of their biggest concerns. I think folks understand that we want to reduce the fuels on the forest, and putting them in a pile is safer than leaving them standing and burning them, but we've got to be able to do better. And I think folks also know that Forest Service was really an economic development engine going back 100 years ago. And I think they still see a lot of that as their role, and they can be a great job creator from that perspective. But I think I want to try to answer this question and one of the ones that I saw in the chat about whether we fund this bioenergy infrastructure, because it's really the financing of this infrastructure where we're falling down. And this is a little bit of a finance nerd answer, so feel free to poke me more on this, Elliot, or move right past it. But I think what we've seen is that there are senior lenders that are standing ready to make loans to a part of the capital structure, meaning a lot of times these will require $20 to $30 million to get one of these things off the ground. Maybe the senior lender is comfortable lending $10 to $15 million against that project. When you combine that with new market tax credits and using an EPIC grant as your pre-construction funding, there's still a need for some mezzanine capital that would provide credit enhancement or some security to those senior lenders. And I think that's a role we may be able to play with some of this concessional or philanthropic capital. I don't think it's probably the right investment for the private sector because the risk return profile isn't there. But as a nonprofit, we have an ability to work with those concessional lenders in a similar way to the state, but in a way that probably wouldn't work with for-profit investors. So I think one piece of this is how do we de-risk those infrastructure investments by providing supply? But then how do we tactically target the parts of the capital structure where these financings are falling down and say, well, it's not a forest resilience bond. It might be a new financial product, but there could be a small fund that could help make that missing middle appear in a way that the iBank, RCAC, some other CDFIs could bring real funds to the table and really unlock this in a much larger way. So I hope that answered your question. And I wanted to try to pull in that other question as well, because I think they're very related.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that's really is the power of potential nonprofit or state or government funding to de-risk and to unlock further capital sources. So, Elisa, why don't we go to Q&A? I haven't been keeping a great eye on it, but why don't we see what's there?
Yeah. So I want to start with a question. It got thumbs up, so people are interested in it, and it's not specifically about finance, but I think it is something that comes up when we start talking about biomass and bioenergy businesses, and it deserves an answer, which is the question is, I also want to address the big misunderstanding of ecosystem function and how much the removal of too much biomass or forest in specific areas, in the questioner's case, was a removal of critical strips of forest between the valley and the high desert of Nevada. This allowed the drought winds to penetrate into the deeper forest and dry out, which then led to dry forest and valleys and then these wind-driven megafires. And if you look at the North Complex fire here in Butte County, it burned right through a patchwork of 10 to 20 acre clear cuts. We must not blindly think, log it, graze it, or let it burn without understanding ecosystem functions. is there any new training happening to fire and forestry to address this issue? And I think, Zach, this is kind of an area where you live a lot. Maybe you'd like to give an answer to that.
Sure, and I should probably kick some of this over to Elliot because I am not a forester. But I think this is a great question because it's also very relevant to some of the fire activity we saw in both Eastern Washington and actually Western Oregon as well, where logging companies had really taken out a number of trees and it created these wind tunnels that actually made fires quite a bit worse. When it comes to planning these projects, because we represent investors and utilities, we don't get involved in the planning. But for the collaboratives that we're a part of, like the North Yuba Forest Partnership, as an example, the MOUs that bring these collaboratives together say, we want to do ecological restoration based on the best available science. And I see collaborations between the Forest Service and the state on things like the historical range of variability of vegetation to understand what did forest structure look like 300, 500 years ago before European management practices took hold, and how can we return the forest to something that looks and feels like that? And yes, there is some thinning that needs to happen in these projects. There's obviously lots of prescribed fire that has to happen. And I think ultimately the challenge is what comes off the landscape just doesn't have a tremendous amount of economic value. And some of our milling infrastructure that goes back decades and decades and decades is better set up for big, large trees that California was known for. Unfortunately, those are the trees we really need to leave in the watershed to help hold everything together and to enhance both habitat, but full ecological function, which doesn't just include flora, fauna, it includes water, it includes air quality, it includes a handful of other things that these forested watersheds are critical for. And I think that's about all I should say since I'm not actually a forester. I've just learned from some really great ones in the past.
I'm not a forester either, but I will add in because I've learned so much. And we say this around the Community Foundation all the time. A healthy forest is one where you can ride a horse through. I think it's maybe like 3 horses abreast. I don't remember exactly. Maybe it even came from you, Zach, that saying. But if you look at, Zach's got some great photos of forest 100 years ago versus now. And the healthy forest it has a healthy level of undergrowth, that it retains the water in there. So that healthy ecosystem is much more vital and less likely to burn. For anybody on the call, visit to any of the experimental forests, up here at Sage Hen, go down 395 and go up towards Mammoth, where they've done this. It's like they literally have swept the floor. But that brings in a whole nother point, which is managing. So this isn't the slash and burn. This isn't cutting timber. This is super specialized forest management that requires very specialized equipment that nobody's really investing in right now. And it's difficult to justify. In Europe, there are machines that are very light on the forest floor and actually can pluck and sort and chip all in one. And we really need to look at that type of equipment for doing these projects to get the material out of the forest.
Can I jump in with just one more add-on to that? I think one of the things that we see in local and rural communities is that they're massively underbanked, meaning if you're not able to go to RCAC or one of these CDFIs, which really cater more to urban areas typically, RCAC I think is the example, they're not able to get financing for this work. But if we had a local contracting company that wanted to buy some of the equipment that Kristen's talking about, and we knew they had 5 years of contracted work because it's part of our next forest resilience bond, it would be so much easier to do that equipment financing. And I think there's lots of examples of that where in public equity markets, you'd call it inside information, but in this nonprofit fixed income, public-private partnership, it's just de-risking these investments, right? If we know that contractor's got 5 years of work, equipment financing is less risky, but also the bioenergy facility is less risky too, because we know that work's going to get done and that supply could eventually get off the forest and go there. So that's why all of these things really need to be a systems level approach, especially from the financing side. If one hand can talk to the other hand, we can get much better deals for folks and really offer financing to these businesses that it hasn't been available to them in the past. And I think that's a really important thing to think about.
Thanks. The next question is for Dan Adler, and it's from David Wilkinson. Where's the best space to create the green bank type of catalyst concessionary lender for the forest restoration economy? And he gives a couple possibilities. One is a CDFI lender like RCAC. like expanding the Tuolumne revolving loan fund or the iBank?
Yeah, thank you for that. I was just typing up an answer in the chat box, but I think it's at iBank, and but let me caveat that. I think it sits at iBank because the need for capital across our climate infrastructure touches every geography and every sector. You know, we're talking not just here about forestry, but we're talking about agriculture, zero emission vehicles, cleaning the grid, industry. So we need a statewide investment strategy that is publicly aligned and driving capital and local partners. So I think it has to sit inside state government, but with the flexibility and capacities that the iBank brings to bear. That said, you know, our ability to, as I mentioned before, really lean on guarantees and sort of conduit partners out into the sectors will be critical here. So I don't know that we need to choose. I would locate, and I'm advocating that we locate the green bank function at iBank. But in terms of finding local partners in the CDFI space that we can provide capital to or financial backstops to, that's a great way to get a running start at locally relevant projects with the deep technical knowledge that we're going to need to succeed. So maybe it's both and.
Great. Now we have a question from Melinda Barrett for Zach. I believe there were some restrictions for Blue Forest to fund biomass plants. Is that still the case? And if so, is there any possibility of that changing in the near future?
Yeah, Lisa, I touched on this in an earlier answer, so I'll be brief here. I think it's a two-part question. One, I think putting together forest resilience bonds can help that supply and help unlock that financing. But I also think there's a specific part of financing, and Lisa, this has come up on our bioenergy calls, obviously, where there are senior lenders that can do this. It's the iBank, it's RCAC, right? And then there's something that the state or federal government is supporting on the bottom of the capital structure, like EPIC grants or new market tax credits. Well, there's a piece in the middle that's missing. And I think that's where we would like to focus and perhaps try to launch something that looks like a concessional loan fund that could sit below the state or a CDFI to give them a little bit more credit enhancement or security in their investment and allow more of that money to come up. So this is something we've been looking into pretty closely, and I'd like to see if there's some opportunities to push something like that forward, because again, it could be $2, $3, $4 million in a $30 million investment that allows Dan and Scott and others at the iBank to make a $15 or $20 million investment. And this is exactly what we need to be looking at and who should play what role. State and feds on the bottom, maybe philanthropies here, and then it's our market rate or slightly below market rate infrastructure investors that could support the rest of this.
Right, and that was actually the next question, which was, I would appreciate talking more about the mezzanine funding. We have the EPIC grants, the watershed improvement grant funds, potential ITC investors, but still need some puzzle pieces.
Yeah, so this is relatively new for us as we've been digging into the space and interviewing all the experts that have been doing this for a long time, folks at the Sierra Institute, folks at RCAC, other NGOs that really understand what's happening on the ground. And we've come to this as the biggest need. We are a pretty small team. I'm not sure we're ready to launch a new product in this space quite yet, but we're doing that research to make something like that available. I think at the end of the day, this piece of mezzanine funding in each one of these projects isn't huge. If you could work with foundations and donor advised funds to get things called program related investments to do this, I think a $20 to $30 million fund, at the high end could really unlock 100 million plus of iBank, RCAC, other sort of senior lenders and getting them to the table. I'd encourage folks, if you have good examples of this or want to talk more, you can reach out. I'm just zach@blueforest.org. I'm happy to have more conversations on this topic because I think there's still a lot of learning to do, frankly.
Thanks. And then just kind of to pull this all together at the end, I've heard the mention of program-related investments and philanthropic capital. How do you see that moving forward? I mean, what do we need in order to really activate that?
Well, it's two things, right? These are both concessional investments. So in a grant, obviously, it's a negative 100% return. You're not looking to get any of your money back. Often program-related investments have a return that's 0 to 1%. They're often structured as a loan. It can be different, but that's pretty common. Whereas they should need 10 or 20% to make the investment, right? So again, it's sort of a below market rate. What do those impact investors want to see? Well, first off, they're impact investors. So we need to be talking about impact and not just telling a story. I think we need to be true to the impact that's happening on the ground. The second piece that these funders, in my experience, have always looked for is how is their capital being leveraged? And I think that's why this Philanthropic capital is such a good fit for this because of what it unlocks in these cases, right? So I think if we can do a better job of telling the impact story of what we're actually doing, everybody on this call right now is an impact investor, whether you know it or not. You're doing really incredible things in the forest. We just need to be better at telling that story so that the folks that have the money in LA and the Bay Area and other things, they understand this is where their water comes from. This is how to create sustainable jobs. This is how we leverage this additional money coming through. And the better job we can do telling that story, I think the more of these folks we're going to see at the table in the years to come.
Dan or Kristen, do you have any other things to say about that?
I completely, Zach couldn't have said it better. I completely agree. That was my point about this is not a rural issue. This is a statewide issue. This is a national issue, but the urban-rural connection is so important here. This is one of the reasons why I'm on a community foundation board, is because when you're with, and SBC, when you're with a mission-aligned organization, looking at, and this is what I'm talking about, patient capital, a 0 to 1 or 2% return. If they're going to get their money back, that's a bonus. It's a totally different way that an investor looks at it, or than the government could look at it. So it's so important. This is, like I said right in the beginning, this is catalytic and it can take risks. And that is, at the end of the day, that is what is so important about philanthropic capital. And it needs to be in this space.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And but I will say that PRA money is not easy to raise. Maybe it's getting easier, but it's always been sort of this brass ring. But in this sector, at least in my experience, finding a way to standardize and organize a program. Same thing applies, at least in my judgment, that a lot of effort to get to that first transaction, but a belief that it's a durable framework and the ability to continuously support something as it scales and have transparency and clear, trusting relationships with whoever else is in the capital stack. That's a great place, I think, for iBank and GoBiz to be as we set this up. We've got limited capital. We want to be leveraging all forms of private. We can do a lot to develop the pipeline and engage the right kind of community partnerships. And then you, for a PRI investor, whoever you are, you can see where you fit and what you unlock. And the standardization of that seems to me to be a really significant opportunity here.
Thanks. Well, that's it for questions and answers. So back to Elliot.
I think we're at time. So I want to take a moment to thank all of our panelists. Thanks for a great discussion. I hope we didn't veer too hard into the financial lingo, but I think it was a great conversation. So I appreciate all your time today. Thanks.
I want to thank Elliot. I thank Elliot and Elisa and all of our panelists today. This was, I think, a really good conversation, starting with Secretary Crowfoot and having Nils, and then sort of our local folks, and then this deeper dive on the financial side of things. As Secretary Crowfoot said, we really are sort of at the state level in the midst of a paradigm shift. We're hearing legislators, as they're debating the wildfire budget proposal package, start to talk about things like long-term sustained funding and long-term investment to manage these needs. And so I feel like we're at a starting point where there's a lot of opportunity, and we know what needs to be done, at least from the on-the-ground side. And we have really big minds thinking about this at the statewide from the financing side. And we have local experts who are ready to sort of embrace the opportunities and get this work together on the ground. SNC has been thinking about this for a long time, and so we're really thrilled that we're sort of setting ourselves up as a state to move on this in new and innovative ways. I think the time is definitely right for systems thinking. Zach said, we need impact investment, among other things, and I think that a big hole in some of this is being able to answer the question for impact and other investors is, are we winning, right? What does it actually take to drive that other investment, to leverage that other investment? And I think one of the things is we need to be answering the question. I think Blue Forest is doing that, and SNC certainly is thinking about that question from a regional perspective. So we feel like the time is right and the time is now, and we will continue to give thought to this and pull together and convene great minds like the folks that you and the voices that you heard today to try and answer some of these questions and continue to do the work that protects our environment, protects and restores our rural communities and their economies, and creates resilient and healthy forests. So thank you again to all of our panelists, our keynote speakers. We really appreciate you being here with us today. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge Elisa Brown and Elliot Vanderkolk and the entire SNC team that was working behind the scenes and has been working behind the scenes to bring this summit to you. Again, our 7th annual summit. If you have questions that didn't get answered, please reach out to us. We're happy to put you in touch with the panelists that spoke today. If you have ideas that you'd like to share with us, please reach out. We'd be happy to hear those as well. We're sorry that we weren't able to get together in person. This was our last event in person last year, and though safety is our highest priority, not only for staff, but for all of you. We do very much hope that we can be together again next March for our 8th annual summit to address the topics that are high of mind and most relevant to the health and well-being of the Sierra Nevada community. So thank you again, everyone, for your participation. For those of you who sat through a very long Zoom call, you have a little bit of found time. We're going to wrap a little bit early today, but we really appreciate you. We appreciate those of you who are working in the region to address these issues, and we really appreciate all of you who are working at the state level. So I think that's it for today. Have a great day. We're really glad that you were here with us, and I think that that's it.